There is a light somewhere on this planet right now switching on for the very first time. It belongs to a machine, a small one, lowered on a cable so long it takes hours to play out, sinking through water that grows colder and blacker with every meter. And when that light finally blinks awake in the dark, 3, 4, 5 kilometers down, it falls across a patch of the seafloor that no eye has ever rested on. Not a human eye, not an animal one with any memory of the sun. Nothing that has ever known light is looking back. For a few minutes, the camera drinks it in. Pale sediment, a slope of stone, maybe a shape moving at the edge of the beam, there and then gone before anyone topside can be sure they saw it. And then the light moves on. Or the cable is hauled back up. Or something fails. A seal, a circuit, the simple, unforgiving math of pressure. And the machine goes dark, and that small circle of illuminated world snaps shut like an eye closing. And here is the thing almost no one stops to feel. That place is now unseen again. We tend to imagine discovery as a one-way door. You find a thing, and from then on it is found, mapped, known, added to the inventory of the world. We learned the shape of the continents that way. We learned the orbits of the planets that way. We hung the whole bright surface of the Earth on the walls of our classrooms and decided, with the easy confidence of a species that has never been told no, that we understood the place we live. But the deep does not work like that. The deep gives nothing permanently. You can lower a light into it and steal a glimpse and bring that glimpse home, and the moment you leave, the dark closes back over the spot you saw, and it returns to being exactly what it was before you came. Unwitnessed, ongoing, utterly indifferent to the fact that for 10 minutes, a small visitor from the surface watched it through a pane of glass. There are billions of such places, and we have seen almost none of them. I want to be careful with my words here, because this is the kind of claim that sounds like exaggeration, the kind of thing that gets stretched in headlines until it stops meaning anything. So let me say it plainly, and let me say it slowly, because I think if you really let it land, it will change something in the way you understand the planet beneath your feet. More of the surface of Mars has been mapped in fine detail than the floor of our own ocean. We have driven robots across the red dust of another world and photographed individual rocks there, and we can tell you, with confidence, the shape of mountains on a planet that no living thing has ever touched. While the actual bottom of the sea on our own planet, the literal floor of the place we were born, remains, across most of its enormous extent, a blur, a guess. A smear of low-resolution estimate stitched together from satellites that can only ever sense the deep indirectly, by reading the faint pull of underwater mountains on the surface of the water far above them. We do not have a map of our own world. Not really. Not the way you think we do. And in that unmapped dark, that vast, cold, lightless majority of our planet, things are happening. Right now, as you listen to this, creatures are moving through water that has never felt a current of human attention. Sounds are rising through the black that we cannot explain and have, in some cases, never explained. Whole communities of life are blooming and feeding and dying around openings in the seafloor we did not even know existed until embarrassingly recently. And every single time we send one of our small machines down to look, it comes back with something we did not expect. A creature no one has named, a landscape no one predicted, a behavior that rewrites a textbook. A question we did not know we should have been asking. We are not running out of things to discover down there. We have barely started. We are a species that has convinced itself it lives on a known world, and the truth, the quiet, enormous, slightly vertiginous truth, is that the largest single environment on Earth, the place where most of the living space on this planet actually is, remains one of the least explored frontiers in the entire reachable universe. It is closer to you than the nearest city. You could, in principle, reach the edge of it by walking into the sea and swimming straight down. And it is more foreign to us than the surface of worlds we will never physically touch. So tonight, we are going to go looking for the edge of what we know. We are going to descend, slowly, deliberately, the way the deep demands. And at every level, we are going to ask not only what is there, but how much of what is there we have actually seen. And the answer, again and again, is going to be almost none of it. We are going to meet the creatures we have glimpsed exactly once. We are going to listen to the sounds we cannot name. We are going to stand at the lip of trenches that have been visited by fewer human beings than have walked on the moon. And we are going to look down into a dark that has kept its secrets through every empire, every war, every century of our restless mapping of the lit world. And somewhere along the way, the question we begin with, why haven't we explored the deep ocean, is going to turn, the way these questions always do, into something larger and stranger and harder to put down. A question about what it means to live your whole life on the small, bright lid of a world whose vast interior you will never know. But that is later. Every honest descent begins where the light still holds, where the water is warm, and the surface still seems like the whole of the sea. So that is where we begin, at the top, in the part we think we understand, because even there, even in the shallows, we have already started to lie to ourselves about how much we can see. Stand on the deck of a ship in the middle of the open ocean, far from any land, and look down at the water and try, really try, to feel how deep it goes. You can't. The mind refuses it. The surface is a hard, bright fact, a moving floor of blue and silver, close enough to touch, alive with light. And below that floor, your imagination simply stalls. You know in an abstract way that there is more water down there, but the body does not believe it. The body looks at the sea and reads it the way our ancestors read it for 100,000 years, as a surface, a boundary, the top of a thing, rather than the thin ceiling of an immensity. This is the first and oldest failure of human perception when it comes to the deep, and we have never fully corrected it. We evolved to live in a world of surfaces, ground beneath us, sky above, a horizon we could walk toward. The ocean breaks that world in a way our intuition was never built to handle, because the ocean is not a surface at all. It is a volume. A staggering, three-dimensional volume of living space, the overwhelming majority of which lies far below anything the sun can reach. Consider what that means in the simplest terms. On land, life is essentially a thin film. It clings to the surface, to the soil, the canopy, the first few meters up and down from the line where air meets earth. Stack the tallest tree against the deepest root, and you have at most 100 meters or so of living vertical space, and even that is generous. The land is a stage with almost no depth. Life on land is a mural painted on a wall. The ocean is not a mural. The ocean is a cathedral, kilometers tall, and life fills it from the gilded ceiling all the way down into a darkness the eye cannot follow. The average depth of the sea is close to 4 kilometers. Not the deepest point, the average. Almost everywhere you could put a pin in the open ocean, there are roughly 4,000 meters of water beneath it. Drop the tallest mountains most people could name into that average depth, and they would vanish, their summits still buried under more than a kilometer of cold, black water. The space available for living things in the ocean is, by some careful estimates, more than 90% of all the habitable volume on the entire planet. And the slice of it that we know, the warm-lit shallows where we swim and fish and film our nature documentaries, is a sliver so thin it barely registers against the whole. We have explored the mural. We have cataloged every brushstroke of the lit world, and we have looked into the cathedral exactly far enough to know that it is enormous and dark and full of something we cannot see. So you might reasonably ask, and people do every time this subject comes up, if it matters so much, if it is so vast and so close, why have we not simply gone and looked? We are not a timid species. We crossed oceans in wooden boats. We climbed mountains that killed us by the dozen. We strapped ourselves to controlled explosions and rode them off the planet. Why is the bottom of our own sea still a blur? The answer is the same answer that haunts this entire story, and we are going to keep circling back to it, each time understanding it a little more deeply. The answer is that the deep ocean is, in the most literal physical sense, one of the most hostile environments that human beings have ever attempted to enter. More hostile in certain ways than space. That is not a figure of speech. Let me show you what I mean. In space, the danger is mostly absence. There is no air, no warmth, nothing to breathe. But there is also nothing pressing on you. An astronaut in orbit floats in a near-perfect emptiness, and the engineering problem, brutal as it is essentially the problem of carrying your environment with you. Bring your own air, your own warmth, your own pressure, and you can survive. The vacuum does not push back. It simply waits. The deep ocean pushes back. The deep ocean pushes back with a force that is almost impossible to convey until you have done the arithmetic, and even then the number is so large it slides off the mind. Every 10 meters you descend into the sea adds the weight of an entire atmosphere on top of you. The weight of all the air in the sky pressing down again and again every 10 meters without pause, without limit, all the way to the bottom. By the time you reach the average depth of the ocean, the pressure on your body is around 400 times what you feel right now. At the deepest points, it climbs past 1,000. We are talking about a force that could crush a submarine hull as if it were an aluminum can stepped on by a boot. A force that turns the simple act of being there into an engineering nightmare of a fundamentally different order than leaving the planet entirely. And the people who learned this first learned it the way humans learn most hard things: by dying. The history of trying to touch the deep is, for a very long time, a history of people who did not understand what they were reaching into, and who paid for that ignorance, one body at a time. Long before there were submarines, before there was any dream of descending, there were the divers. The breath-hold divers who went down for pearls and sponges and coral in the warm, shallow seas of the world, generation after generation. They could not go deep, not by the standards of this journey. 30 meters, 40, the very best of them perhaps a little more, on a single held breath, in the lit water near the surface. But even there, even in what we would now call the shallows, the ocean was already extracting its price. Their lungs were squeezed to a fraction of their size by the pressure. Their bodies aged before their time. Many of them went blind or deaf, or simply did not surface one ordinary morning, and the sea kept them, and the village mourned, and the next season someone's son went down again, because there was something on the bottom worth dying for. There always is. That, too, is part of this story. But these were free divers, dancing on the very threshold of the deep, never truly entering it. The first attempts to actually descend, to seal a human being inside something and lower them into the dark on purpose, did not come until startlingly late in our history. We had mapped the coastlines of the world. We had built telescopes that could see the moons of Jupiter. We had a theory of how life itself evolved. And we still had essentially no idea what lay a single kilometer beneath the keels of our own ships. In fact, for most of the 19th century, the educated consensus, the thing serious scientists believed, was that the deep ocean was dead, empty. A lightless, lifeless desert of crushing cold where nothing could possibly survive. There was even a name for the idea, a tidy theory that below a certain depth, life simply stopped. That beneath perhaps 500 or 600 meters, the seafloor was a sterile graveyard, holding nothing but mud and the slow rain of the dead from above. It was a comfortable theory. It let people imagine the deep as a void, a nothing, a place that did not require their attention. It meant the part of the planet they could not see was the part that did not matter. And then, in the 1870s, a ship called the Challenger set out to test it. She was a converted warship, her guns stripped out and replaced with laboratories, sent around the world by the British on a voyage that would last nearly 4 years and become, in many ways, the founding expedition of the entire science of the deep sea. Her crew had a deceptively simple method. They carried miles of rope and wire, weighted at the end, and they would stop the ship over the open ocean and lower that line down and down and down, paying it out for hours, waiting to feel it touch a bottom that, according to the prevailing wisdom, should not have been all that far away. The line kept going. In some places, it went down so far that the crew could scarcely believe the readings. They were measuring depths no one had imagined. The line sinking through 1 kilometer, 2, 3, 4, the wire vanishing into a blue-black nothing that seems to have no floor at all. And at one point in the Western Pacific, near the islands of Guam and the Marianas, they dropped a sounding line into a place where it sank past every previous record, past 7 kilometers, into a trench so deep that the number, when they finally worked it out, seemed less like a measurement and more like a rumor. They had stumbled, almost by accident, dragging a weighted rope through the dark, onto the edge of the deepest place on the surface of the Earth, a place that would one day carry the ship's own name, the Challenger Deep. But the depths were not even the most unsettling discovery. The most unsettling discovery was on the ends of the dredges they hauled back up from the bottom. Because the bottom was not dead. Out of the sterile graveyard that the theory promised, the Challenger's nets came up holding life. Strange life. Pale, soft, eyeless, alien things. Creatures pulled from depths where the textbooks insisted nothing could exist. Brought up dying and deformed by the change in pressure, but unmistakably, impossibly alive. With every haul, the comfortable theory of the lifeless deep died a little more, and a far stranger truth began to take its place. Wherever they looked, however deep, however cold, however dark, something was already there. The deep was not a void. The deep was inhabited. It had been inhabited the entire time by a cast of living things so vast and so unfamiliar that the scientists aboard spent the rest of their lives and filled 50 enormous volumes, just beginning to describe what that single voyage had pulled out of the water. And here is the part that should sit with you as we stand at the very beginning of our descent. The Challenger expedition is considered the birth of deep-sea science, the moment we first seriously looked. And it happened less than a century and a half ago. For the entire span of human civilization before that, every pyramid, every cathedral, every philosopher who ever wondered about the nature of the world, the deep ocean was, to us, a total blank. We did not know it had a floor we could not reach. We did not know it was full of life. We did not know that most of our own planet lay in a darkness we had never entered. We are, even now, only a few generations into looking. And we have looked at so little. After the Challenger came the slow, dangerous business of trying to send not just a rope, but a person into that dark. And the people who first volunteered for it understood more clearly than most that they were doing something the human body was never built to survive. In the early 1930s, a naturalist named William Beebe and an engineer named Otis Barton built a ball. That is more or less what it was, a hollow sphere of cast steel, barely large enough for two grown men to crouch inside with their knees against their chests, with walls thick enough to resist the pressure of the deep, and 3 small windows of fused quartz to look through. They called it the bathysphere, the deep sphere, and they planned to do something that, until that moment, no human being had ever done and survived. They were going to be sealed inside it on a single steel cable and lowered off the side of a ship into the open ocean. And they were going to go down until the light gave out. And look. Read the accounts of those early dives, and what comes through, underneath the scientific language, is fear. Not panic, these were brave and disciplined people, but the deep, sane fear of someone who fully understands the situation they are in. They were dangling in a steel ball at the end of a cable, with no way to propel themselves, no way to rise on their own, no rescue possible if anything went wrong. A single flaw in the welding, a single failure of the cable, a single crack in those quartz windows, and the ocean would come in. And it would not come in the way water comes through a leak in a boat. At those pressures, a failure would be instantaneous and total. The sea entering with such violence that the men inside would not have time to understand that anything had happened. They knew this. They went down anyway. And what Beebe saw through those tiny windows changed the way he wrote and thought for the rest of his life. Past 200 meters, past 300, the color drained from the world until everything was a blue so deep it became almost a presence, a substance, a thing you could feel pressing against your eyes. And then even the blue was gone, and there was the black, the true black of the deep, broken only by the lights of living things, sparks and flashes, and slow pulses of cold fire drifting past the windows. Creatures lit from within, swimming through a darkness Beebe described as more absolute than any night on the surface of the earth. He saw shapes he could not identify. He saw flashes he could not explain. He came back up, again and again, having looked into a world that no human had ever directly witnessed. And he tried to find words for it, and he mostly failed, the way everyone who goes down there fails. Because the deep does not translate into the language of a sunlit creature. Beebe and Barton reached, eventually, a depth of just over 900 meters, less than a kilometer. To us, standing at the edge of a 4-kilometer average and an 11-kilometer maximum, 900 meters is the shallow end. The mural. And yet it was, at the time, the deepest any human had ever gone and returned to tell of it. And it had required an act of nerve that is difficult to fully appreciate now. To be sealed in a steel ball and dropped into the dark on a string, trusting your life to a cable and a weld and the steady hands of people on a deck you could no longer see. That is what it cost in the 1930s just to reach the top of the deep. Not the bottom, the top. It would take another quarter century and a fundamentally different kind of machine before anyone reached the actual floor of the deepest place on Earth. And the story of that dive is one of the strangest and most revealing chapters in the entire history of exploration. because of what it tells us, not about the deep, but about us. The year was 1960. The machine was called the Trieste, and it was not a sphere on a cable, but a true submersible. A thick steel cabin slung beneath an enormous float filled with gasoline. Because gasoline is lighter than water and resists being compressed, and so it could provide buoyancy at depths where ordinary air-filled tanks would simply implode. The Trieste was ugly and ungainly and brilliant. And on a January morning, 2 men climbed inside it. A Swiss engineer named Jacques Picard, whose father had designed the craft, and a young United States Navy officer named Don Walsh. And they aimed it at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the very place the Challenger expedition had brushed with a sounding line nearly 90 years before. The deepest known point in all the oceans of the world. The descent took most of 5 hours. 5 hours of sinking. The 2 men crowded into a cabin barely wider than a closet, watching the depth gauge climb into numbers no one had ever survived. The water outside cooled toward freezing. The pressure outside mounted toward a force that, at the bottom, would press on every square inch of the hull with the weight of several automobiles. And then, somewhere around 9,000 meters deep into the descent, there was a sound. A loud, sharp crack that ran through the whole craft. One of the outer windows, a thick cone of acrylic, part of the entry structure, had fractured under the pressure. The cabin held. The crucial pressure sphere was intact, but the 2 men inside, sinking through the deepest water on Earth, hours from any possibility of rescue, had just heard their vessel begin to break. They talked it over, quietly, in the cold, and they decided to continue down. Sit with that for a moment. They were lower than any human had ever been, descending into a place that could kill them in a heartbeat. Their craft had just audibly cracked. And they chose to keep going because they were so close to the bottom of the world, and they did not know if anyone would ever get the chance again. They reached it. Just under 11 kilometers down, the Trieste settled, gently, onto the floor of the Challenger Deep, raising a soft cloud of pale ooze that drifted up around the windows. 2 human beings at the absolute deepest point on the surface of their planet. And there, at the bottom of everything, in a place the textbooks of a previous century had sworn was sterile and dead, Walsh and Picard looked out the window and saw, or believed they saw, a fish. A flat, pale, soul-like creature resting on the bottom that turned and moved slowly away from their lights. Scientists have argued ever since about what that creature really was. At that depth, through that small window, in those conditions, certainty is almost impossible, and some have suggested it may have been a sea cucumber misjudged in the gloom. But in a sense, the debate misses the point that mattered most in that moment. Because whatever it was, the lesson was the same, and it was overwhelming. There is life at the very bottom, down where the pressure could fold steel, down where no one believed anything could survive. Something was already living, calmly, when the first human visitors arrived. We did not discover an empty room at the bottom of the world. We discovered yet again that we had arrived late to a place that had been inhabited all along. And now here is the part of the Trieste story that says something genuinely uncomfortable about the kind of creatures we are. After that dive, after 2 men risked their lives to touch the deepest point on Earth, after one of the great feats of exploration in human history, we did not go back. Not for a year, not for a decade, not for a generation, for more a decade, not for a generation. For more than half a century, no human being returned to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. We had touched it once in 1960, and then we simply left it alone. In that same span of time, we put 12 human beings on the surface of the moon. We sent machines beyond the edge of the solar system. We built telescopes that could see to the beginning of time. And the deepest place on our own planet, closer to every one of us than the moon will ever be, we visited a single time, planted no flag, took our crackled window and our glimpse of a fish, and turned our backs on it for 52 years. Until a filmmaker named James Cameron, of all people, funded and engineered his own submersible and made the dive alone in 2012, becoming only the third person ever to reach the bottom, and the first in over half a century. More people have stood on the summit of the highest mountain on Earth in a single crowded climbing season than have ever reached the bottom of the deepest trench in the entire history of our species. Think about the imbalance buried in that fact. The deep is not far. It is not unreachable. It is right here, beneath every ship and every wave, a few kilometers straight down from almost anywhere on the blue majority of the planet. And we have visited its deepest floor fewer times than we have visited the moon. It is not that we cannot go. It is, in some sense we will keep coming back to, that we have chosen not to. The unexplored deep is not a frontier that defeated us. It is a frontier we walked away from. And the reasons for that, the strange, revealing reasons we turned our attention upward to the stars and away from the dark beneath us, are part of what we are here to understand. But before we get to why we stopped looking, you have to understand what we left unlooked at. You have to understand the sheer scale of the blank we walked away from. So let me show you the map. Or rather, let me show you that there isn't one. Here is something most people have never been told and find genuinely hard to believe when they first hear it. We do not have a detailed map of the floor of our own ocean. Not most of it. Not even close to most of it. When you picture the seafloor, and most people, if they picture it at all, imagine some smooth blue gradient on a globe, a vague slope from the coast down into a featureless deep. What you are imagining is not a map, it is a guess. For the overwhelming majority of the ocean floor, what we have is not the kind of map we have of the land, where you can zoom in and see individual hills and valleys and the shapes of things. What we have, for most of the deep, is a low-resolution approximation, pieced together from satellites that cannot see the bottom at all, and can only infer its rough shape by measuring tiny variations in the height of the sea surface. Because a large underwater mountain, with its extra mass, pulls the water above it into a faint, almost imperceptible bulge that a satellite can detect from orbit. That technique is clever, and it has given us a blurry global picture, a sense of where the great ridges and rises and trenches roughly are. But it is coarse beyond anything we would accept for the land. At that resolution, an underwater mountain has to be enormous, kilometers across, before it shows up at all. Anything smaller is simply invisible. There could be a feature the size of a city down there, a peak, a canyon, a structure, and our global maps would show nothing but smooth blue, because it is too small for the satellites to feel, and no ship has ever passed over it with the kind of sonar that could actually see it. To truly map the seafloor, to image it the way we image the surface of Mars, you have to send a ship, physically, across every patch of ocean, dragging high-resolution sonar through the water, listening to the echoes of sound pulses bouncing off the bottom kilometers below. It is slow, it is expensive. A single ship, working continuously, maps a thin ribbon of seafloor as it goes, and the ocean is so vast that to cover all of it at high resolution with the technology we have would take a fleet of ships many years and an enormous amount of money that no one, historically, has been willing to spend. And so the blank persists. There is an international effort underway now, a project with the goal of producing a complete, high-resolution map of the entire ocean floor by the end of this decade, pulling together data from research vessels and navies and even private yachts and fishing fleets, all of it stitched into one growing picture. It is a genuinely heroic undertaking, and the last time the people running it took stock of how much of the seafloor had been mapped to a decent resolution, the figure was around a quarter. Roughly a quarter of the bottom of our own planet imaged in real detail, which means roughly 3/4 of it, an area many times larger than all the dry land on Earth combined, has never been seen clearly. We do not know its shape. We have a smear, a guess, a low-resolution rumor of what is down there. Let that recalibrate something for you. We speak so easily about exploring the world, about how there is nothing left to discover, about how the age of exploration is over and every coastline is charted and every mountain climbed. And it is, on the land. But the land is the minority of the planet. The majority, the great wet bulk of the world, is, in terms of actual detailed knowledge of its very shape, mostly unexplored. There are mountain ranges down there longer than anything on the continents that we have never properly imaged. There are canyons that would dwarf the Grand Canyon, hidden in the dark, their walls never seen. There are, almost certainly, features of the seafloor that no one has ever suspected, waiting in the unmapped 3/4, because every time we do map a new patch in detail, we find things we did not expect to find. And it gets stranger, because mapping the shape of the bottom, the bare topography, the hills and trenches, is only the very first and shallowest kind of knowing. A detailed map tells you the contours of a place. It does not tell you what lives there. It does not tell you what is happening there. Even if we finished the map tomorrow, even if we had a perfect picture of every ridge and valley on the ocean floor, we would still know almost nothing about the deep. Because a map of the terrain is not a map of the life, and the life is the part that keeps astonishing us. We have, by some estimates, physically explored, sent eyes or instruments to, in any detailed way, only a tiny fraction of 1% of the deep ocean. Not the seafloor shape, the actual deep, the living volume of it. A fraction of a fraction. We have looked into the cathedral through a few small windows, in a few scattered places, for a few brief hours at a time, and from those glimpses, we have assembled everything we think we know about the largest habitat on Earth. And so, almost everything I am about to tell you comes with an asterisk. Every creature, every behavior, every discovery, it is real, it is documented, it is astonishing. But it is also, almost certainly, the smallest tip of something far larger. For every strange thing we have managed to see, there are uncounted strange things we have not. The deep is not a solved place with a few remaining mysteries. It is an almost entirely unsolved place with a few scattered solutions. Which brings us to the creatures. And not the ones we know, the ones we have met exactly once and lost and never found again. For most of human history, the largest predator anyone could imagine in the sea was a thing of pure rumor. Sailors spoke of it in every age and every language. A monster with arms longer than the masts of a ship, with eyes the size of dinner plates, rising out of the deep to drag whole vessels down into the dark. It appears in the oldest stories we have. It was carved into the borders of ancient maps, coiled around ships in the spaces where the cartographers had no real knowledge to put. And for thousands of years, serious people dismissed it as exactly that. A story, a sailor's exaggeration, the human mind doing what it always does with the unknown, which is to fill it with teeth. Except this one was real. The giant squid is not a myth. It is an actual animal, with a body that can stretch longer than a school bus when you count its two enormous feeding tentacles, with the largest eyes of any creature that has ever lived, eyes the size of human heads, evolved to gather the faintest whisper of light in a world that has almost none. It is one of the largest invertebrates on the planet, and here is the thing that should stop you cold. We knew this animal was real. We had pieces of it. We had its dead body washed up on beaches and hauled up in fishing nets and pulled, half digested, from the stomachs of sperm whales who hunt it in the deep. And yet, for the entire span of human civilization, right up into the 21st century, no human being had ever seen a living giant squid in its own world. Not once. We had the corpse. We had never seen it alive. Think about how strange that is. This is not some microscopic thing, not some obscure worm in the mud. This is one of the biggest animals in the ocean, a creature so large and so dramatic that it gave rise to legends across every seafaring culture on Earth. And we could not find it. We knew it was down there. We knew roughly where. We had been pulling its dead body out of the water for centuries, but the living animal, in its own dark home, eluded every attempt to witness it, decade after decade, as cameras improved and submersibles deepened, and the technology of looking advanced and still came back empty. The giant squid simply refused to be seen. It was not until the early 2000s that a team of Japanese researchers, after years of patient effort, finally managed to capture the first photographs of a living giant squid in the deep. And only a few years after that, the first video footage of one, moving through the black water, alive, its great arms reaching, its enormous eye catching the light. A creature out of the most ancient nightmares of our species, filmed for the first time, alive, within the lifetime of most people listening to this. And I want you to really feel the weight of that, because it is a window into something much larger than one squid. If the giant squid, enormous, famous, hunted, legendary, an animal we have known about for as long as we have written anything down, if that animal could hide from us so completely, for so long, in our own ocean, until practically yesterday in the span of history, then what about everything that is not enormous? What about the things that are not famous, not legendary, not the size of a bus? What about the small, the soft, the quiet, the things no sailor ever saw washed up on a beach? The things that have no place in any legend because no human has ever encountered them at all. The giant squid is the exception that reveals the rule. It is the one we eventually caught up with, and it took us nearly all of human history to do it. The deep is full of things we have not caught up with. The deep is mostly things we have not caught up with. And the giant squid, for all its mystery, is at least an animal we can recognize. It has eyes, arms, a body, a shape our minds can hold. The deeper you go, the more you encounter creatures that do not even fit the categories we brought down with us. There is, drifting somewhere in the abyss, a kind of squid that almost no one has heard of, glimpsed only a handful of times in the entire history of looking. An animal with thin, impossibly long arms that bend at strange elbows and trail behind it for what may be many meters, hanging in the water like the legs of some enormous, delicate spider built for a world with no floor. We have seen it perhaps a few dozen times ever, almost always from the cameras of deep-sea robots that happened to be pointed in the right direction at the right, impossible moment. We do not know how it feeds. We do not know how it breeds. We do not know how long it lives, or how many of them there are, or how deep they truly go. We have a handful of grainy clips of one of the strangest large animals on the planet, And that is, essentially, the entire sum of human knowledge about it. These are not edge cases. This is the normal condition of deep-sea biology. Open any catalog of the creatures of the deep, and you will find, again and again, the same quiet, devastating phrase tucked into the scientific descriptions. Known from a single specimen. Known from one individual, caught once, in one place, at one time, described, named, preserved in a jar in a museum somewhere, and never seen again. Not in that place, not anywhere, not by anyone in all the years since. A whole species, an entire kind of living thing, represented in all of human knowledge by a single body in a single jar. And the obvious question, the one that should make the hair stand up on your arms, is what those single specimens actually mean. When you find a creature once and never again, there are only a few possibilities, and all of them are staggering. Maybe it is genuinely rare, a species hanging on at the edge of existence in numbers so small that catching even one was a freak of chance. Or maybe, and this is the more likely answer for most of them, maybe it is not rare at all. Maybe it is perfectly common, abundant, going about its life by the millions in the dark, and we have only ever caught one, because we have only ever looked in that one spot, that one time, with that one net. Maybe the single specimen is not the last of its kind. Maybe it is one ordinary individual out of countless billions, in a world so vast and so unvisited that catching even one was a once-in-history accident. We do not know which. For most of these creatures, we have no way of knowing. They exist, in our understanding, as a single point of light in an enormous darkness, and everything around that point, how common they are, how they live, what their lives are actually like, is pure black. There is a further cruelty to this, a problem that makes the deep even harder to know than its sheer size would suggest. Many of the most common and important animals in the deep ocean are soft, gelatinous, built almost entirely of water and the most delicate of tissues, because in a world with so little food, you cannot afford to build a heavy, energy-expensive body. You survive by being mostly nothing, a faint structure of jelly drifting in the dark. And these creatures, these gossamer animals that may be among the most abundant large life on the planet, are almost impossible to study by the old methods. Because the moment you try to catch one in a net and haul it up through kilometers of changing pressure and temperature, it disintegrates. It comes apart. It arrives at the surface as a smear of mucus and shreds, an unrecognizable ruin. All its structure and beauty destroyed by the very act of bringing it into our world. So for generations, we did not even know these animals existed in the forms they truly take, because we only ever saw their corpses, mangled by capture. It was not until we developed the ability to film them gently in place, with submersibles and remote cameras that could approach without touching, that we began to see them as they actually are. Vast, transparent, pulsing communities of creatures, some of them colonial animals stretching tens of meters long, made of thousands of cooperating individuals, drifting through the dark like living constellations. There may be more of this kind of life in the ocean than almost any other, and we are only now, in the last few decades, learning to see it at all, because for all of history before that, our only tool was a net, and the net destroyed the very thing it caught. This is the recurring tragedy of exploring the deep. The tools we use to reach it change what we find. The pressure that defines the place is the same pressure that ruins the evidence. We are trying to study a world whose inhabitants, in many cases, cannot survive the journey to ours. creatures so perfectly fitted to the crushing dark that to lift them into the light is to kill and unmake them. And so the deep guards its secrets twice over. First by being almost impossible to reach, and then by destroying so much of what we manage to bring back. Which means the honest catalog of deep-sea life is not really a catalog at all. It is a scattering of fragments. A photograph here, a single jarred specimen there, a few seconds of grainy video of an animal no one can fully identify, a smear of ruined jelly that we know, now, was once something extraordinary. From these fragments, we have built our entire picture of the most populous environment on the planet, the way you might try to reconstruct an entire lost civilization from 3 broken pots and a single page torn from a book in a language no one alive can read. And the rate at which new fragments arrive, the rate at which we are still, right now, finding things we have never seen before, tells you everything about how little of the picture we actually have. Every time we go down, we find new species. Every single time. I want to make sure that lands with the full force it deserves, because it is one of the most extraordinary facts in all of modern science, and we have somehow let it become unremarkable. When biologists mount an expedition to almost any unexplored part of the deep sea, lower their cameras, drag their gentle nets, send their robots crawling across the bottom, they come back with creatures that have never been described. Not occasionally, not as a lucky bonus, as a matter of routine, as the expected, ordinary, every-time outcome. A single voyage to a single unexplored patch of seafloor can return with dozens of entirely new species, sometimes more. Animals that no human being has ever seen or named in the whole history of our species, hauled into the light for the first time and added, one by one, to a list we now understand to be almost laughably incomplete. On land, this does not happen anymore. Not at that scale, not for animals of any size. The land is mostly known. When a new large land animal is discovered, it is a global news event, a once-in-a-generation rarity, precisely because the land has been so thoroughly explored that there is almost nothing left to find. We have walked nearly all of it. We have cataloged nearly all of it. The age of discovery on the surface really is mostly over. But in the deep, the age of discovery has barely begun. In the deep, finding the unknown is not the exception. It is the job. It is what happens by default the moment you point a camera somewhere new. And the implication of that, when you follow it all the way down, is almost dizzying. Because if we find new species nearly every time we look, and we have looked at only a tiny fraction of the deep, then the number of species still down there, undescribed, unnamed, unknown, is not in the hundreds or the thousands. The honest scientific estimates run into the millions. Millions of kinds of living thing sharing this planet with us at this very moment that we have never seen, never named, never suspected. An entire living world, larger in its sheer variety than everything we have cataloged in all of history, hidden in the dark beneath us. We like to think we have taken inventory of life on Earth. We have not. We have taken inventory of the life that happens to live where we can easily see it, on the land, in the shallows, in the lit and accessible margins of the world. The rest of it, the majority of it, very possibly the vast majority of it, remains uncounted, in a darkness we have only begun to enter. When a child asks how many kinds of animal there are, and we give them a number, we are not really answering. We are reporting the size of our own ignorance dressed up as knowledge. The true number is unknown, and it is enormous. And most of it lives in the deep. And this is where the story takes on an edge, because there is a clock now ticking against all of this unknown life, But we will come to that. We will come to the strange and bitter race between discovery and destruction that is unfolding in the deep right now, while no one is watching. First, I want to take you somewhere even less visible than the creatures, because the deep does not only hide what lives in it, it hides what it sounds like. And some of the most haunting evidence that there is more down there than we understand comes not from anything we have ever seen. It comes from things we have only heard. Sound behaves strangely in the deep ocean. It travels far, much farther than it does in air, and far farther than light ever could in water. There are layers in the sea where the temperature and pressure combine in just the right way to trap sound and carry it for enormous distances, a kind of natural channel running through the deep, along which a noise made in one part of the ocean can travel for thousands of kilometers before it fades. Whales, it turns out, have known about this channel for millions of years. They use it. A whale calling into that deep layer can, in principle, be heard by another whale on the far side of an ocean basin, its voice carried across distances that dwarf anything our own bodies could ever shout across. We discovered this channel for our own reasons, and they were not gentle ones. During the long, tense decades of the last century's great rivalry between nations, the navies of the world became obsessed with the idea of hearing what moved through the deep, specifically, of hearing the submarines of their enemies. And so they laid down vast networks of underwater microphones, hydrophones, anchored to the seafloor across whole oceans, wired back to listening stations on shore where analysts sat in quiet rooms with headphones, listening to the sea. It was a secret system, built for war. But it had an unintended consequence that would echo for decades. For the first time, human beings were listening continuously to the deep ocean. And the deep ocean, it turned out, was not silent. It was full of sound. Much of it, eventually, we learned to explain. The groan of ice, the grinding of the sea floor as the plates of the earth shift against one another, the distant rumble of undersea earthquakes, and the slow collapse of underwater slopes. And threaded through all of it, the voices, the astonishing, varied, almost musical voices of whales, calling and answering across the deep channel, an entire layer of the ocean alive with conversation in frequencies that, when we finally slowed the recordings down enough to hear them properly, sounded less like animals and more like something out of a dream. We had been living above this the entire time. An ocean talking to itself, in a voice pitched too low and stretched too long for our ears to catch, and we never knew until we built machines for war and accidentally learned to eavesdrop on the deep. But some of the sounds we could not explain, and those are the ones I want to tell you about. Because among all the noises the hydrophones picked up over the years, the explained ones, the cataloged ones, the ones we eventually traced to ice and stone and whale, there were a handful that did not fit. Sounds that rose out of the deep with no obvious source. Sounds that were recorded and analyzed and argued over, and in some cases never satisfactorily resolved at all. The most famous of them was picked up in the late 1990s, rising out of the remote South Pacific, far from any coast, an immense, low sound, so powerful that it was detected by sensors separated by thousands of kilometers, which means that whatever made it was, by any measure, enormous, or at least enormously loud. And the shape of the sound, the way it rose and swelled and faded, had an oddly organic quality to it, a rising profile that, to some of the people who first heard it, sounded unsettlingly like it could have come from something alive. For years, it had no agreed explanation. It joined a small, grim catalog of unexplained deep ocean sounds, each given a plain working name by the analysts who logged them, names that did nothing to soften how strange they were. sounds that pulsed, sounds that swept upward in pitch, sounds that slowed and trailed off, sounds recorded once or twice and never heard the same way again, drifting up out of a darkness no one could see into, logged by machines, played back in quiet rooms by people who were not entirely sure how to feel about what they were hearing. Now, I want to be honest with you, because the honesty is more interesting than the legend. Most of these sounds, in the years since, have been given likely explanations, and the most haunting of them, the great rising sound from the South Pacific, is now generally believed to have come not from any creature, but from ice. From the cracking and grinding and fracturing of enormous icebergs as they break apart and scrape along the sea floor near the frozen edge of the world. A process that, it turns out, can produce sounds of exactly that scale and that strange rising shape. The monster, in other words, was probably the ice. The deep, in this case, was not hiding a creature. It was hiding a process we simply had not yet learned to recognize. But I do not think that makes the story smaller. I think it makes it larger. Because look at what actually happened there. A sound rose out of the deep ocean, and for years, the best minds we had, with the best instruments we had, could not explain it. It took a great deal of effort and a great deal of time before we could even arrive at a probable answer. And even now, that answer is our best inference, not a certainty pulled up into the light. And this was a loud sound. A sound powerful enough to be heard across half an ocean. If a noise that big and that loud could baffle us for years, then think about all the quieter sounds. The ones too faint to travel far. The ones happening right now in the unmonitored vastness of the deep, where we have laid down no microphones at all. We hear only the loudest events, in only the few places we happen to be listening. The rest of the ocean's voice, the overwhelming majority of it, falls into the dark, unheard. And not every sound has been explained. There are recordings still sitting in archives, logged decades ago, that have never been satisfactorily accounted for. Brief, strange events, captured once with no source anyone could ever pin down. The acoustic equivalent of those single specimen creatures. A single trace of something, witnessed once, never repeated, never resolved. We do not say, in the careful language of science, that they were made by anything in particular. We say only that we do not know what made them. And that phrase, "we do not know," turns out to be the truest and most frequent sentence in the entire study of the deep. But of all the sounds the hydrophones have caught, there is one that haunts me more than any unexplained pulse or sweep, precisely because we do understand it, and understanding it only makes it sadder. Somewhere in the vast, deep channels of the Pacific, for decades now, there has moved a single whale that sings at the wrong frequency. Whales of its kind call at one pitch. This one calls at another. Higher, off, different from every other whale in the sea. We have tracked its voice across the ocean for years, season after season, a lone signal moving through the deep, calling and calling in a frequency that no other whale seems to call back to. Some researchers believe it may be a hybrid, or an animal with some quirk of anatomy or development that pitched its voice away from the chorus of its species. We do not fully know. What we know is the sound. A whale, somewhere in the immense dark of the open ocean, singing across thousands of kilometers of water in a voice that, as far as we can tell, no one of its own kind has ever answered. Calling out, year after year, into the deep, and hearing, in return, only the ocean. We do not even know if it is truly alone. It may have companions we cannot detect. It may be perfectly content by whatever measures contentment means to a whale. We are, after all, projecting, taking a sound and pouring our own loneliness into it. But the image is hard to set down once you have picked it up. A single voice, moving through the largest unexplored space on the planet, calling out across a darkness no human has ever crossed, into water that carries its song for 1,000 kilometers in every direction, and waiting, and calling again. Whatever the truth of that whale's life, the recording is real. The voice is real. It is out there right now, somewhere in the dark, and we can hear it, and we cannot reach it, and we do not fully understand it. And that, in the end, is what listening to the deep teaches you. We built instruments to hear it, and what we heard was a world, a vast, active, talking, sounding world, most of which we cannot interpret, most of which we cannot even hear, happening in a dark we have barely entered. The sounds we have explained are a comfort. The sounds we have not are a reminder. And the silence between them, the great unmonitored hush of the ocean, where no microphone has ever been laid, is the largest part of all. And it is full of things making sounds that no human has ever heard or ever will. We are not listening to the deep. We are listening to a few keyholes in an enormous closed door, and straining to guess at the size of the room beyond from the little that leaks through. And what leaks through is enough to tell us the room is immense and busy and largely beyond us. But sound and creatures are only the surface of how strange the deep gets. Because somewhere down there, in the last 60 years, we found something that did not just expand our catalog of life. It broke our understanding of what life requires to exist at all. And to reach it, we have to go deeper still, past the zone of the falling dead, down to the floor of the world, where the planet itself is bleeding. To understand why the next discovery shook the foundations of biology, you have to understand the single assumption that nearly all of life on Earth was thought to rest upon. Everything alive needs energy, and for almost every living thing we had ever studied, the ultimate source of that energy was the same: the sun. Plants and algae capture sunlight and turn it into living matter. Animals eat the plants, or eat the animals that ate the plants, and so the energy of the sun flows up through every link of every food chain on the planet. Even in the deep ocean, as we descend, this remains true for kilometer after kilometer. The creatures of the twilight and the midnight and the abyss are all, ultimately, living off the slow rain of dead matter that drifts down from the sunlit surface, the leftovers of a feast of sunlight that happened far above them. The sun, we believed, was the engine of all life. Strip away the sun, and life as we understood it simply could not run. And then, in the late 1970s, a small submersible carrying scientists descended onto a stretch of seafloor near a ridge in the eastern Pacific, in water far too deep for any sunlight to reach, expecting to find more of the same: the cold, sparse, slow life of the deep bottom, surviving on its meager reign of distant death. And instead, they found a city. That is not too strong a word for what they saw. In the perpetual dark, 2.5 kilometers down, around cracks in the seafloor where hot fluid welled up out of the planet, there was an explosion of life so dense, so abundant, so wildly, riotously alive, that the scientists aboard could not at first believe what they were looking at. Great fields of giant clams, tangled mats of strange creatures, and, most astonishing of all, forests of enormous tube-dwelling worms, animals taller than a person, swaying in the current, their bodies tipped with plumes of brilliant red, clustered in their thousands around the openings in the rock. In a place that should have been nearly empty, in a darkness the sun has never touched, there was an oasis of life as crowded and as thriving as a coral reef in the shallows. It made no sense. There was no sunlight here. There was no rain of dead matter rich enough to feed an explosion like this. By every rule we knew, this density of life in this place was impossible. And yet there it was, swaying in the dark. The answer, when it came, was one of the most profound discoveries in the history of biology. Those cracks in the seafloor, the hydrothermal vents, were not just leaking heat. They were leaking chemistry. Seawater seeps down into the cracked, hot rock near where the planet's crust is being born and torn, gets superheated deep underground, dissolves minerals and chemicals out of the stone, and comes roaring back up out of the seafloor as a hot, mineral-rich fluid, often loaded with compounds that, to most life, are simply poison. Hydrogen sulfide, the chemical that gives rotten eggs their stench, pouring out of the planet's interior into the cold, dark water. And something down there had learned to eat it. Not the worms directly. The worms, it turned out, had no mouth and no gut at all. They had given those up entirely. Instead, inside their bodies, they carried colonies of microscopic bacteria, billions of them. And those bacteria had mastered a trick that rewrote everything we thought we knew about how life can be powered. They could take the chemical energy locked in that poisonous vent fluid, the hydrogen sulfide welling up from inside the Earth, and use it, instead of sunlight, to build living matter from scratch. Chemistry instead of light. The energy of the planet's own interior instead of the energy of the distant star. The bacteria fed on the chemistry of the Earth, and the worms fed on the bacteria they carried inside themselves, and an entire dense, thriving ecosystem stood there in the eternal dark, running on a power source that had nothing whatsoever to do with the sun. Do you understand what that meant? It meant that the sun was not, after all, the necessary engine of all life. It meant that life could be built on the raw chemistry of a planet's interior, in total darkness, indefinitely, with no connection to the surface world at all. It meant that the whole bright sunlit story we tell about life on Earth, the grass and the forests and the food chains reaching up to the light, was not the only possible story. It was one story. And down in the dark, around the bleeding cracks in the seafloor, an entirely different story had been quietly running, for who knows how long, on principles we had never even imagined. And that discovery did not just change biology, it changed where we look for life in the entire universe. Because if life on Earth can run on the chemistry of a planet's interior, in darkness, with no sun, then suddenly, all those frozen, lightless worlds out in the solar system, the moons of the giant planets with their oceans of liquid water hidden beneath kilometers of ice, the places we had written off as too dark and too cold and too far from the sun to host anything alive, suddenly those places looked very different. Suddenly the question was not whether a world had sunlight. The question was whether a world had liquid water and a source of chemical energy from within. And several of them, we now believe, may have exactly that. Dark oceans, beneath ice, warmed and fed by the chemistry of their own interiors, in conditions that look unsettlingly like the vents we found on our own seafloor. The discovery of life around the hydrothermal vents of the deep ocean is one of the central reasons we now believe that life might exist elsewhere in our own solar system. We learned to imagine alien oceans by looking into our own. And here is the deeper unease, the thing the vents pressed on that we have never quite resolved. There is a serious scientific idea, not proven but taken seriously by serious people, that life on Earth itself may have begun in a place like this. Not in some warm, sunlit pool at the surface, but down in the dark, around the chemical-rich heat of the deep vents, where the raw ingredients and the raw energy came together in the cracks of a young and violent planet. If that is true, and we do not know that it is, but if it is, then the deep ocean is not some strange exception to life. The deep ocean is where life came from. The sunlit surface, the world we live in and call home, and assume is the main event, would be the later development, the colony that crawled up out of the dark, the branch, and the dark vents at the bottom of the sea would be the root. We would be the strange ones. We would be the life that wandered away from the cradle and forgot where it was born. We do not know. That is the refrain of this whole journey, and that is never more true than here. We do not know whether life began at the vents. We do not know how many vent communities are down there. We have explored only a tiny fraction of the great ridges where they form, and we find new ones with new creatures nearly every time we go. We do not know how the life at one vent relates to the life at another, isolated vents scattered across the dark seafloor, each one a separate oasis in a desert of cold, possibly each evolving its own private caste of creatures, the way the trenches do. We found an entire alternative foundation for life on our own planet less than 50 years ago, almost by accident, on a single dive, and we have barely begun to explore it. And the vents are not even the strangest thing the deep floor is hiding. Because where the vents are hot, there are other places down there that are cold and chemical and even more alien. Places where the seafloor leaks not superheated mineral fluid, but slow seeps of methane and other compounds. Cold seeps, around which their own strange communities cluster, living on a different chemistry again. And in some places on the bottom of the sea, there are things that should not, by any intuition, be able to exist at all. There are lakes at the bottom of the ocean. Lakes, with shores and surfaces and waves that lap when something disturbs them, pooled on the seafloor, kilometers underwater. They are pools of water so dense with dissolved salt that they do not mix with the ordinary seawater above them. They sit separate, heavier, distinct, forming actual bodies of water resting on the floor of a larger body of water, with a visible boundary between them, a shoreline beneath the sea. Submersibles have filmed their robotic arms dipping into the surface of these underwater lakes and watched the surface ripple and settle, exactly as a real lake would. The brine in them is so concentrated, so toxic, that most creatures that blunder into it die. And so their shores are sometimes lined with the preserved bodies of animals that wandered in, ringed by death, like something out of a myth. And yet even there, even in and around those poisonous undersea lakes, specialized life finds a way. Microbes and creatures adapted to conditions that would kill almost anything else, living on the edge of pools of brine at the bottom of the sea, in the dark, where there are shorelines no human imagined, and waves that almost no one has ever seen. Lakes beneath the ocean, forests of worms eating the chemistry of the planet, cities of life in the dark, powered by the Earth's own interior. We found all of this in the last few decades, in the tiny fraction of the deep floor we have managed to visit. And every one of these discoveries was a surprise. Every one of them broke a rule we thought was fixed. Every one of them whispered the same thing. You do not understand this place. You have only begun to look. The rules you brought down here from the sunlit world do not all apply, and you have no way of knowing how many more of them are about to break. And then there is the discovery that may be the strangest of all, the one that suggests the deep ocean's life does not even stop at the sea floor. Because in recent decades, We have learned that beneath the bottom of the deep sea, down inside the solid rock and sediment of the planet's crust, there is more life. Microbes, living in the tiny spaces between grains of stone, kilometers below the seafloor, in total darkness, under unimaginable pressure, eating the slow chemistry of the rock itself. A whole biosphere inside the planet. And the most staggering thing about it is the pace at which it lives. Some of these sub-seafloor microbes appear to divide so slowly, to live so far down in the realm of the patient, that a single generation may take not days or years, but centuries. Individual cells that may persist for thousands of years, metabolizing so slowly that they sit at the very edge of what we are even willing to call alive. Some estimates suggest that the total mass of this hidden, buried, almost unimaginably slow life inside the rock beneath the deep ocean floor, may rival or exceed all the life on the entire sunlit surface of the planet combined. Read that again, slowly. There may be as much living matter sealed inside the dark rock beneath the seafloor as there is in every forest, every grassland, every ocean surface, every living thing you have ever seen or could ever see, all of it together. An entire shadow biosphere, the size of the visible world, living in the dark inside the planet, that we did not even know was there until practically the day before yesterday, and that we still understand almost nothing about. We are standing on it, right now. Beneath the floor you are standing on, beneath the ocean floor, beneath that, in the rock, in the dark, there is life. Slow, patient, ancient, vast, getting along entirely without the sun, entirely without us, entirely without any awareness that the bright, busy world above it exists at all. We share our planet with a second living world the size of our own, sealed in darkness beneath our feet, and we have only just learned it is there. And we are running out of zones to descend through. There is only one place left below us, the deepest place. The trenches, the Hadal world, named for the underworld of the dead, where the pressure reaches a level that does something to life we have never seen anywhere else. That is where we are going next. And it is against every old expectation, against the dead deep theory of a century ago, against all our intuitions about crushing dark. It is full of the living. The deepest places in the ocean are not really part of the ordinary seafloor at all. They are wounds in it. Almost everywhere, the bottom of the deep sea is the abyssal plain, those vast, flat, soft expanses of sediment that stretch for thousands of kilometers in lightless monotony. The floor of the world as it exists across most of the planet, lying around 4 to 6 kilometers down. But in a few dozen places, scattered across the globe, the seafloor does not stop there. In those places, one of the great plates of the Earth's crust is sliding beneath another, dragging the bottom of the sea down with it into a long, narrow gash, a trench, plunging far below the surrounding plain, down to 7, 8, 9, 10, and in the deepest case, nearly 11 kilometers below the surface of the sea. These trenches are the deepest features on the face of the Earth, and there are only a handful of them. They are not a continuous layer like the zones above. They are isolated scars, separated from one another by enormous stretches of shallower seabed, each one cut off, alone. And that isolation is the key to one of the most remarkable things about them, because a deep trench is, biologically, an island. Worse than an island, a sealed valley at the bottom of an already bottomless dark, separated from the next trench by vast plains of seafloor that its inhabitants, adapted to the crushing pressure of the very bottom, may never be able to cross. The creatures that evolve in one trench may be entirely cut off from the creatures in another, each trench running its own private, separate experiment in how to survive at the very edge of where survival is possible. There may be whole families of creatures down there that exist in a single trench and have never existed anywhere else on Earth, marooned at the bottom of the sea, evolving in total isolation, found in one gash in the planet and nowhere else in the universe. And we have visited most of these trenches barely at all, some of them almost not at all. We do not know what is in them. We only know that whatever is very likely found nowhere else. Think of them as the loneliest islands imaginable. An island in the sun, however remote, at least shares a sky with every other island. The same rain falls on it. The same birds and seeds and storms drift between it and the rest of the world. But a trench shares nothing. No light reaches it. No bird crosses it. No seed drifts down into it. It is sealed beneath 11 kilometers of crushing water, separated from its neighbors by a desert of seabed its creatures cannot traverse, running its own sealed experiment in the dark, in conditions no creature from the trench next door has ever experienced. Each one is, in the most complete sense possible, a separate world. And they sit at the bottom of our own ocean, dozens of them, mostly unvisited, each one possibly holding life that exists in that single gash and nowhere else, ever, in all of time. And the central problem all of that trench life is solving, the thing that defines the Hadal world, is the pressure. We have talked about pressure all the way down, but at the bottom of the deepest trenches, it reaches a level that does something genuinely new, something that, when scientists understood it, redrew the boundary of life itself. The danger at those depths is not crushing, exactly. Not the way you might picture, a body flattened by the weight. Deep-sea creatures are mostly water, and water barely compresses, so there is no air-filled cavity to collapse, no hollow space for the pressure to crush. The real danger is far subtler and far stranger. It happens at the scale of molecules. Life depends, at its most fundamental level, on proteins, the tiny molecular machines that fold themselves into precise shapes and carry out nearly every process that keeps a cell alive. And the function of a protein depends entirely on it holding the right shape. At the immense pressures of the deep trenches, the water itself begins to push on those proteins, to interfere with the way they fold, to deform them, to bend them out of the shapes they need to do their work. Life, at the bottom of a trench, is fighting a constant battle to hold its own molecules in the correct form against a pressure that is trying to crush their very chemistry. And the creatures that live there solved it with a single, quiet, extraordinary trick. They fill their bodies with a particular protective molecule, a chemical that crowds in around their proteins and braces them, stabilizing their shape against the deforming weight of the pressure, like an invisible scaffolding holding a structure upright in a storm. And the deeper a creature lives, the more of this molecule it carries. As you descend through the trenches, creature after creature, the concentration of this protective compound rises, steadily, in lockstep with the depth, as if each animal carried written into its own chemistry a precise measurement of exactly how deep it has learned to live. But the molecule has a limit, and the limit turns out to be one of the most haunting numbers in all of biology. Because if a creature keeps packing in more and more of this protective compound to survive deeper and deeper, the concentration eventually reaches a point where the chemistry inside its body would match the saltiness of the seawater outside it. And at that point, the entire system fails. The delicate balance that lets water flow correctly in and out of a creature's cells collapses. The fundamental machinery of life stops working. And scientists were able to calculate the depth at which that limit is reached, the depth past which no fish, no matter how perfectly adapted, can pack in enough of the protective molecule to survive. the depth at which the chemistry simply runs out of room. It comes out to somewhere around 8,200 meters. And here is the part that makes the hair stand up. When researchers went looking, they found that the deepest fish anyone has ever observed live at almost exactly that predicted depth, and not below it. The math drew a line. And life, it turns out, stops right at the line. There is a floor to where fish can exist, not because the trench ends, but because chemistry says no further. Below that depth, the trenches still plunge on, kilometers deeper, all the way to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. But no fish lives there. They cannot. The pressure has finally found the edge of what a fish can be. And the creature that lives closest to that edge is not some armored nightmare, not some fanged horror out of the legends we keep projecting onto the deep. It is a small, pale, almost translucent fish, a kind of snail fish, soft-bodied, gentle-looking, delicate as a ghost, drifting along the bottom of the deepest trenches at a depth that would crush a steel submarine, holding its own molecules together with a quiet chemical trick, living calmly in the most extreme environment any vertebrate animal on Earth has ever colonized. The deepest living fish we know of is not a monster. It looks almost fragile. It looks like something that should not be able to survive a gentle current, let alone the weight of the entire ocean. And it lives at the bottom of the world, unbothered, exactly where the mathematics says the very last fish can be. We did not even film these deepest snailfish in their own world until quite recently, in the modern era of cameras tough enough to be dropped to the bottom of the trenches and survive. And when we finally saw them, these soft, pale, unhurried creatures going about their lives at the absolute floor of what life can endure, there was something almost tender about it, after all the monsters we had imagined. The deepest fish in the ocean turned out to be one of the gentlest-looking things in it. But the Hadal Zone held one more discovery for us, and this one is not wonderful. This one is the moment the story of the unexplored deep turns dark in a way that has nothing to do with the absence of light. Because when explorers in recent years finally returned to the very bottom of the deepest trenches, when a wealthy explorer named Victor Vescovo built a submersible capable of repeated dives to the floor of the Challenger Deep and went down, becoming one of the very few human beings ever to reach it, and when others followed, finally ending the long, half-century neglect that had begun after the Trieste, they reached the deepest, most remote, most untouched place on the entire planet. A place almost no human had ever seen. A place sealed beneath 11 kilometers of water at the very bottom of the world. And there, waiting for them, in the deepest point on Earth, was a piece of human garbage. A plastic bag, or wrappers, synthetic debris, unmistakably manufactured, lying on the floor of the Challenger Deep. We had been to the bottom of the world only a handful of times in all of history, and our trash had beaten us there. We had not yet explored the deepest trench, had not yet cataloged its creatures, had not yet begun to understand the sealed and separate world it contains. But our plastic had already arrived. The pollution of the surface had drifted and sunk and settled all the way down into the one place we thought of as the most pristine and untouchable on the planet. And it was there to greet us when we finally came. And it was not just the bag. When researchers caught the small creatures living at the bottom of the deepest trenches, those amphipods, the little scavengers that swarm the Hadal floor in their countless numbers, and examined the tissues inside their bodies, they found our chemistry there too. Pollutants, microplastics, the molecular residue of our industrial world, woven into the very flesh of animals living at the deepest, most remote point on Earth. Animals that have never been anywhere near the surface, that live in a place no sunlight has ever reached, that most humans will never see. We have not finished discovering the life of the deep trenches, but we have already contaminated it. We are poisoning a world before we have even met it. There is something almost unbearably revealing in that sequence. We are a species that has explored so little of its own ocean that we find new creatures nearly every time we look, that has visited the deepest point on the planet fewer times than the moon, that does not even have a detailed map of 3/4 of the seafloor. And yet our waste has reached every part of it, even the parts we ourselves have never reached. Our ignorance of the deep is nearly total. Our impact on it is already nearly total. We have managed, somehow, to touch everything while understanding almost nothing. We have left our mark on the bottom of the world without ever having properly looked at it. And that gap, the chasm between how little we know and how much we are already changing, is about to become the most urgent part of this entire story. Because there is a race underway right now in the unexplored deep, while almost no one is paying attention. A race between the people who want to study the deep and the people who want to use it. And the thing being raced for is the very part of the planet we understand least of all. On the abyssal plains, those vast, flat, soft expanses of mud that cover nearly half the entire surface of the planet, 4 to 6 kilometers down in the dark, there is treasure lying on the bottom. And that fact may turn out to be the most dangerous thing about the deep ocean that we have ever discovered. The treasure does not look like treasure. It looks like rocks. Dark, lumpy stones, roughly the size of a fist or a potato, scattered across the abyssal mud in some regions in their countless billions, lying half buried in the sediment as far as any camera can see. They are called nodules, and they form over spans of time that beggar the imagination, accreting one microscopic layer at a time, atom by atom, from minerals dissolved in the seawater and the sediment, growing perhaps a few millimeters across in 1,000,000 years. Some of the nodules down there are older than the human species, older than most of the mammals. They have been sitting on the bottom of the world, growing imperceptibly in the dark, since before there was anyone on the surface to imagine them. And they are made of exactly the metals our modern world is most desperate for. The same metals that go into the batteries of electric cars and the circuits of our devices and the infrastructure of the energy systems we are racing to build. Cobalt, nickel, manganese, copper, rare elements, all of it concentrated in those slow, dark stones lying loose on the seafloor, waiting, in some places, in quantities that dwarf the known reserves on all the dry land on Earth. The deep ocean floor, it turns out, may hold a greater supply of some of these critical metals than every mine on every continent combined. And they are just lying there, on the surface of the mud, waiting to be picked up. You can already feel where this is going. For decades, the difficulty of reaching the abyssal plain, the same crushing depth and brutal cost that has kept the deep unexplored, also kept it safe. The nodules were known about, but the technology and the economics of hauling them up from 4 kilometers down simply did not work. It was easier and cheaper to mine the land. And so the deep stayed untouched, not out of any wisdom or restraint, but simply because we could not yet figure out how to profit from it. That is changing. The technology is maturing. The demand for these metals is exploding as the world races to electrify and rebuild its energy systems. And so, right now, in this decade, there is a serious and accelerating push to begin mining the deep ocean floor, to send enormous machines down to the abyssal plain, machines the size of buildings, to drive across the bottom of the world and scrape up the nodules and pump them, and the mud they sit in, up through kilometers of water to ships waiting on the surface. An entire new extractive industry aimed at the single largest and least understood environment on the planet is preparing to begin. And here is the thing that should stop you. We do not know what we would be destroying. We have explored so little of the abyssal plain, cataloged so little of its life, understood so little of how it works, that we genuinely cannot say what the cost of mining it would be. The creatures that live on and around those nodules, and there are creatures, strange, specialized animals that grow on the nodules themselves and exist nowhere else, because the nodules are the only hard surface in a desert of mud. Many of them have never been named. Some of them have been described for the very first time by the same surveys that the mining companies commissioned to assess the seafloor they intend to dig up. We are discovering the inhabitants of this place in the very act of preparing to eliminate them. We are meeting them and marking them for destruction in the same breath. And the destruction would not be gentle, and it would not be temporary. Remember how slowly the deep moves. Remember the nodules that took 1,000,000 years to grow a few millimeters. Remember the abyssal plain, where the temperature has not changed in 1,000 years, where the water at the bottom last touched the sky before recorded history, where animals live for centuries, and a single fall of food is the great event of a season. The deep is the slowest place on Earth, and that means that the deep does not heal. When scientists have gone back to look at small patches of the abyssal plain that were disturbed by experimental mining tests decades ago, just decades, they have found the scars still there, the tracks of the machines still pressed into the mud, the life still not returned, the bottom still wounded, after a span of time that would be nothing on the surface, but is an age in the slow world of the deep. Damage done to the abyssal plain may persist not for years, not for decades, but for centuries or longer. We would be carving permanent wounds into the largest, least understood, slowest healing environment on the planet, to harvest metals from a place we have barely begun to explore. And there is a bitter irony folded into all of this that is almost too perfect to bear. Much of the demand for these deep-sea metals comes from the urgent global effort to build a cleaner energy future, to move away from the fuels that are warming the planet and damaging the natural world. The metals in those nodules are wanted in large part precisely so that we can stop harming the Earth in the old ways. And to get them, we may end up devastating one of the last great untouched wildernesses left on the planet, an environment whose life we have not even finished discovering. We may save one part of the world by sacrificing another part we never even got to know. That is the kind of impossible knot the deep keeps tying for us, the kind of decision that has no clean answer, made about a place we cannot see, on the basis of knowledge we do not have, with consequences that will outlast everyone now living. Who decides? That is its own strange and unsettling story. The deep ocean floor, beyond the waters that any nation controls, belongs, in the language of international law, to no one and to everyone. It is meant to be the common heritage of all humankind, governed by an international body created to oversee it, an organization most people have never heard of, meeting in offices most people will never see, drawing up the rules that will determine whether and how the largest unexplored environment on the planet gets opened to industry. The fate of the deep sea, a place that took 4 billion years to become what it is, a place we have barely glimpsed, a place that may hold answers to where life itself began, is being decided right now, in conference rooms, by a process almost no one is watching, on a timescale driven by markets and demand and the impatience of the surface world, applied to the most patient place that exists. And it is not only the nodules. There is talk of mining the hydrothermal vents themselves, the very oases of life that rewrote our understanding of biology, dense with minerals, as well as with creatures found nowhere else. There is talk of the deep ocean as a source not just of metals, but of molecules, of bioprospecting, of harvesting the strange chemistry of deep-sea organisms for new medicines, new materials, new industrial compounds. Because creatures that have spent millions of years solving the problems of pressure and cold and darkness and chemical extremes have evolved molecular tricks we could never have invented. And some of them may be worth more than any metal. There is a real prospect that a cure for some human disease is, at this moment, sitting unknown inside the body of some undescribed creature in the deep. A creature that mining might destroy before we ever meet it, erasing not just a species, but an answer, a possibility, a piece of knowledge we will never even know we lost. That is perhaps the most haunting form of the threat. Not just that we might destroy life in the deep, but that we might destroy it before discovering it. That we might erase entire species, entire chemistries, entire chapters of the planet's living story without ever having read them. Extinction is always a loss, but to drive something extinct that you never even knew existed, in a place you never explored, for a profit measured against an ignorance you never bothered to lift, there is a particular kind of poverty in that. We would be burning a library we never opened, in a language we never learned, to warm ourselves for a single night. And the deep cannot speak for itself in any of these rooms. It has no voice in the conference halls. It does not lobby. It does not vote. It simply continues, in the dark, doing what it has done for 4 billion years, slowly, patiently, indifferently, while a species that has seen almost none of it decides its fate based on what that species needs this decade. The creatures of the abyssal plane do not know that machines the size of buildings may soon be coming for the stones they live on. The slow biosphere inside the rock does not know. The deepest snailfish, drifting at the edge of where life can exist, does not know. They go on, as they always have, in a dark that has never once concerned itself with us. And we go on deciding, on the surface, in the light, what will become of a world we never took the time to understand. So that is the race. On one side, a handful of scientists and a scattering of small machines trying to explore and understand and document the deep before it changes, working with a tiny fraction of the funding and attention that gets poured into the exploration of space. On the other side, the gathering momentum of an entire industry and the appetite of a civilization, turning toward the deep not to know it, but to use it. And the great open question, the one that hangs over everything we have talked about tonight, is which of those will reach the deep first, and at scale? Will we explore it before we exploit it? Or will we strip mine the last unknown wilderness on the planet, while it is still, mostly, unknown? We do not yet know the answer. The story is being written right now, in our own moment, in our own decade. But to understand what is truly at stake, to understand why some people fight so hard for a dark place most humans will never visit, you have to understand the people themselves, the small number of human beings who have given their lives to the deep, because their story tells you something about what the deep does to a person, and about why it might be worth protecting, even if no one ever sees it again. There is a question buried under everything we have talked about, and we have circled it without quite landing on it. So let me land on it now. Why? Why, given all of this, given that the deep ocean is the largest environment on the planet, given that it is closer to us than the moon, given that it is full of undiscovered life and unexplained sounds, and the possible origin of life itself. Why have we so thoroughly neglected it? Why did we walk away from the Challenger Deep for half a century while we walked on the moon? Why do we have more detailed maps of Mars than of our own seafloor? Why does the exploration of the deep ocean receive a tiny sliver of the funding and the attention and the wonder that we lavish on the exploration of space? Part of the answer is simple and physical, and we have already met it. The deep is brutally, expensively hard to reach, and in certain ways harder than space because of that relentless mounting pressure that no amount of cleverness fully tames. It is genuinely difficult and dangerous and costly to put eyes on the bottom of the sea, and that difficulty has slowed us at every step. But difficulty is not the whole answer, because space is also brutally hard and brutally expensive, and we pour ourselves into it anyway. The deeper answer, I think, is about something stranger than money or engineering. It is about where we want to look. And we, as a species, want to look up. There is something in us, something old, maybe something built into the kind of creature we are, that turns our faces toward the sky. We have always done it. We told stories about the stars before we told stories about almost anything else. We placed our gods up there. We dreamed of flight and of leaving the Earth long before we had any means to do it. The sky is the direction of aspiration, of transcendence, of the future. Up is where we imagine we are going, and the deep ocean is the opposite of all of that. The deep is down. The deep is descent and pressure and darkness and the crushing weight of things. The deep is, in the oldest layers of our imagination, where the dead go, where monsters live, where the light cannot follow. We named its deepest zone after the underworld for a reason. To go up is to ascend toward the divine. To go down is to sink toward something we have feared since before we had words for fear. And so we built our great romance of exploration around the wrong frontier. We made the stars our destiny and the depths our nightmare. And we funded the dream and neglected the nightmare. And the result is that we have sent machines billions of kilometers across the solar system while leaving most of our own ocean floor in the dark. It is one of the strangest imbalances in the whole human story. The unexplored frontier we chose to chase is unimaginably far away and almost entirely hostile to life. The unexplored frontier we chose to ignore is right beneath us, teeming with living things, and possibly the place we came from. We looked past our own origins to stare at the void. And maybe that, too, says something true about what kind of creature we are. But not everyone looked up. There has always been a small number of people who turned the other way, who felt the pull of the down instead of the up, who looked at the dark water and wanted more than almost anything to know what was inside it. And the lives of those people are some of the most quietly extraordinary in all of science, precisely because they chose a frontier that brings so little glory. There are no parades for the people who explore the deep. There is no equivalent of the moon landing, no moment when the whole world stops to watch. The deep does not photograph well for the cameras of the surface world. Its discoveries are often small, soft, strange, hard to explain, easy to overlook. To devote your life to the deep is to devote it to a frontier the rest of the world has mostly decided to ignore. And the people who do it will tell you, almost to a person, that it changes them. That you cannot spend years sending your eyes into that darkness, staring through the small windows of submersibles, watching the feeds from robots crawling across the bottom of the world, witnessing the soft, strange, patient creatures of the deep going about their lives in a place that should be impossible. You cannot do that year after year without something shifting in you. The fear goes first. Everyone, they say, is afraid of the deep at the start, in that old animal way, the way we are all a little afraid of the dark and the cold and the crushing. And then, slowly, as you keep looking, the fear turns into something else, into a strange, fierce, protective tenderness toward these creatures that no one else has ever seen, scraping out their lives in the most hostile place on the planet, asking nothing, harming no one, glowing quietly in a dark that will outlast every one of us. There are scientists who have given their entire lives to the deep, who have spent more hours staring into black water than most people spend on any single thing, and who speak about that darkness the way you might speak about someone you love, with awe and worry, and a kind of grief at how little of the world's care it ever receives. And there is a particular sorrow in that work, the sorrow of being almost alone in caring about something enormous. To understand, as these people understand, just how vast and how wondrous and how endangered the deep is, and to watch the rest of the world look the other way, toward the stars, toward the surface, toward anything but the dark majority of its own planet, is a lonely thing. They are trying to speak for a place that cannot speak, to a world that does not want to listen, about a wilderness it cannot see. And the clock, as we have seen, is running. Some of them are racing now not just to explore the deep, but to document it before it is changed, to record what is there before the machines come, to name the creatures before they can be erased. It is exploration in the shadow of loss, discovery against a deadline, the bittersweet work of trying to learn a place even as the means to destroy it are being assembled. And yet they keep going down. That, in the end, is the thing that moves me most about them. Knowing how hard it is, how little it pays, how few will ever notice, how much may be lost regardless. They keep sending their small lights down into the dark, keep pressing their faces to the windows, keep adding their fragments to the broken catalog. Keep returning to a darkness they have learned not to fear, but to love. Because there is something down there worth knowing. There always is. The same thing that sent the breath-hold divers down for pearls. The same thing that sent Beebe and Barton into the dark in a steel ball. The same thing that kept Walsh and Picard descending, even after their craft cracked around them. The simple, irreducible, deeply human need to know what is there. To look. To not leave the largest part of our own world in the dark, simply because it is dark. And the tools they have to look with are, finally, beginning to change. After all the centuries of sounding lines and steel balls and ruined nets, after all the ways the deep has defeated and outlasted our attempts to know it, we are entering, right now, an era in which the means of exploring the deep are advancing faster than they ever have before. And those new tools may be about to do something we have never managed in all of history. They may be about to let us see the deep not in scattered fragments, but whole. For most of the history of deep exploration, the fundamental problem was the human body. To see the deep, we thought, we had to go there. To put a person, fragile and air-filled and built for the surface, inside a vessel strong enough to keep the ocean out, and lower that person into the dark, at enormous cost and enormous risk. Every dive was an expedition. Every expedition was a gamble. And the human being at the center of it was the most expensive, most vulnerable, most limiting part of the whole arrangement. That is ending. The future of deep exploration increasingly leaves the human body on the surface, or removes it from the equation entirely. We now send down robots, tethered and untethered, machines that can withstand pressures that would kill any person, that can stay down for hours or days, that can crawl across the bottom and reach into crevices and film the soft creatures gently in place without destroying them. We are building autonomous vehicles that can be released into the deep to map and survey and explore on their own, roaming the dark without a cable, without a pilot, without a ship hovering overhead, gathering data from places no crewed vessel could ever afford to reach. We are beginning, slowly, to take the human fragility out of deep exploration, and in doing so, to make it vastly cheaper and vastly more possible to look at more of the deep, more often, for longer. And there is a new way of seeing the deep that does not require any machine to find a creature at all. It is one of the most remarkable developments in all of modern biology, and it works like this. Every living thing in the ocean is constantly shedding traces of itself into the water, flakes of skin, scales, cells, fragments of its own genetic material, drifting away on the currents. And we have learned to scoop up a sample of seawater and read the genetic ghosts floating in it. To identify from a single bottle of water the creatures that have recently passed through that patch of sea, without ever seeing them, without ever catching them, without ever sending a single eye into the dark. We can sample the water of the deep and read, in the molecules dissolved in it, the catalog of what lives there, including, sometimes, the traces of creatures we have never identified, genetic signatures that match nothing in any database, the molecular shadows of animals no one has ever seen. We are learning to detect the unknown by the trace it leaves behind, to know that something is there before we have any idea what it is. Think about what that means. We are developing the ability to take the measure of life in the deep without the deep ever having to give that life up to us. We could, in principle, map the living inventory of the entire ocean from the genetic traces in its water and find almost certainly that it is even richer and stranger and more crowded with unknown life than even the most generous estimates have guessed. And the machines and the methods are getting cheaper and faster and better year over year in the way that technology does. We may be standing right now at the very beginning of the first era in which it becomes genuinely possible to explore the deep ocean at scale, to finish the map, to read the water, to send fleets of tireless machines into the dark, to finally begin to see the largest part of our own world as it actually is. And that is a hopeful thought, and I want to let it be hopeful, because so much of this story is heavy. It is genuinely possible that the people listening to this will live to see the deep ocean explored as it has never been explored before. To see the blank 3/4 of the map filled in, to see thousands upon thousands of new creatures discovered and named, to see the unexplained sounds explained, and the single specimen species found again, and the great isolated trenches surveyed at last. We may be the last generation to live in near total ignorance of our own ocean, and the discoveries that lie just ahead may be among the greatest in the history of exploration. But, and there is always a but with the deep, there has been one at every layer of this descent. That hopeful future is in a race with the other one. The same technologies that make it possible to explore the deep more cheaply and more thoroughly are the same kinds of technologies that make it possible to exploit the deep more cheaply and more thoroughly. The robots that can survey the abyssal plain can also map it for mining. The capability cuts both ways. And so the great open question is not whether we will finally be able to reach the deep at scale. We will. The question is what we will do when we get there. Whether the era of true deep exploration that is dawning right now will be remembered as the age in which we finally came to know the largest part of our world, or the age in which we finally came to consume it. Both are possible. Both are being built right now by the same hands. And the strangest part is that the deep itself is utterly indifferent to which one we choose. It will not fight us. It cannot. It has no defense against us except its own depth and darkness, the same depth and darkness that protected it for 4 billion years and is finally, in our moment, beginning to fail as a shield. The deep does not know we are coming. It has never known anything about us.
And whatever we decide to do with it, it will simply receive, in silence, in the dark, the way it has received everything else that has ever fallen into it.
There is a deeper reason the deep remains unexplored, and it is the most unsettling of all, because it does not go away, no matter how good our machines become. It is this: even when we do manage to look, we may be missing most of what is there, not because it is hidden in the dark, but because it is happening in ways we were never built to perceive. Consider how we see. We see the deep, almost always, by bringing light to it, by switching on a lamp and looking at what the lamp reveals. But that act is itself a kind of intrusion, a falsification. The deep is a world without light. The creatures there have spent millions of years adapting to perfect darkness, and many of them have built their entire lives around the absence of it. When we arrive and flood a patch of the deep with a bright, artificial beam to film it, we are not seeing the deep as it is. We are seeing the deep as it looks when a blinding alien light is suddenly switched on in the middle of it. Creatures flee. Creatures freeze. Creatures that hunt by their own faint glow are washed out and erased by our floodlights. The behaviors we film are, in many cases, the behaviors of animals reacting to being abruptly, violently illuminated. We are like someone trying to study the life of a dark forest at midnight by walking through it with a searchlight, scattering everything, and then describing what we saw fleeing from us as though it were ordinary life. The deep we have filmed may be, in some real sense, a deep that is responding to us, and the deep that exists when we are not there, in its true and undisturbed darkness, may behave in ways we have almost never witnessed at all. And it goes further than light. The creatures of the deep communicate, hunt, and sense the world through channels we are only beginning to suspect, and may not be able to follow at all. There is, threaded through the entire deep ocean, a language we barely read. The language of living light. Most of the animals down there can make their own light, and they do not make it at random. They use it. They use it to lure prey, to startle predators, to find mates, to signal, to hide, to deceive. Flashing and pulsing and glowing in patterns and colors and rhythms that almost certainly carry meaning. An entire visual language of light written across the dark, most of which we have never decoded and may never fully decode. We see the flashes. We do not, for the most part, understand what they say. We are like travelers in a country where everyone is speaking constantly in a language we do not know, and we file reports describing the sounds without grasping a word of the conversation. And there is a discovery that should make you wonder how much of that conversation is happening in channels we cannot even detect. Because we know of at least one creature down there that found a way to step entirely outside the visual world everyone else inhabits. Nearly all the light in the deep is blue. That is the color that travels best in seawater, the color the deep settled on, the color almost every deep creature makes, and almost every deep eye is built to see. Red light dies in seawater within a few meters. Nothing in the deep ever evolved to see it, because in the deep, red light effectively does not exist. And yet there is a fish down there that learned to produce red light, and to see it when nothing else can. It moves through the dark, carrying its own private illumination in a color invisible to everything around it, lighting up its prey in perfect detail, while that prey perceives nothing, hunting with a beam that only it can see, operating in a channel of reality that, to every other creature in its world, simply is not there. And the biologists who study this draw the obvious, chilling conclusion. If one creature found a way to perceive a channel that the entire rest of its world is blind to, then how many other secret channels are there? How many invisible conversations, invisible wars, invisible signals are passing through the deep right now in registers we have not even thought to look for, between creatures we have barely met, in senses we do not possess? We are exploring the deep with eyes and instruments built for the surface, tuned to the things our kind of life happens to notice. And the deep may be full, may be saturated with phenomena that fall entirely outside what we are equipped to detect. The one creature that cheats the visual rules is simply the one we happened to catch. The deep may be playing 1,000 games we cannot even see the board for. This is the most humbling form of the unexplored. It is one thing to say that we have not yet been to most of the deep, that we lack the ships and the money and the time to reach it all. That is a problem we can imagine solving. But it is another thing entirely to suspect that even where we have been, even where we have looked most closely, we have been perceiving only a thin slice of what is actually happening. That the deep is not just physically beyond our reach, but in part, perceptually beyond our grasp, conducting its true life in colors and signals and senses we were never built to share. We could explore every cubic meter of the ocean and still, in this sense, fail to truly know it. Because to know it might require senses we do not have, a way of being in the world that no surface creature could ever fully wear. And maybe that is the final wall. Maybe there is a part of the deep that is unexplorable, not because of pressure or darkness or cost, but because it is genuinely alien. Because it is a world that runs on perceptions and meanings that a sunlit, air-breathing, light-dependent creature like us can approach, but never fully enter. We can map the shape of the deep. We can count its creatures. We can read the genetic traces in its water. But the lived experience of the deep, what it is actually like to be a creature suspended in that crushing dark, sensing the world through channels we lack, speaking a language of light we cannot read, living a life adapted to conditions that would unmake us in seconds, that may remain forever closed to us. We can know about the deep. Whether we can ever truly know the deep from the inside, the way it knows itself, is a different and much harder question. And the honest answer is probably no. We are visitors to a world we do not belong to, equipped with senses meant for somewhere else, glimpsing what we can in the brief flashes of our small lights, and mistaking those glimpses for understanding. The deep does not yield itself to us. It permits us, occasionally, a look. And even the look is more partial than we know. And then there is time. Because the deep does not only operate in a different space than we do, it operates in a different time. A flow of time so slow, so patient, so vastly stretched beyond the rhythm of the surface that it makes our entire history of exploration look like a single blink. Everything in the deep is slow. We have touched on this at every layer, but I want to gather it all together now, because the slowness is not just a curiosity. It is one of the deepest truths about the place, and it carries a moral weight that bears directly on everything we are doing to the deep right now. The cold of the deep, that unchanging chill, a degree or two above freezing, holding steady across centuries, slows everything down. Metabolisms idle to a crawl. Hearts beat slowly. Growth stretches across spans of time that have no parallel in the warm, bright surface world. In the deep, the clock barely moves. There are creatures in the cold deep that may live for centuries. There is a kind of shark in the cold northern waters that grows so slowly and lives so long that an individual swimming through the dark today may have been born hundreds of years ago, may have been alive before the modern world existed, may have been swimming slowly through the cold for longer than any nation now on Earth has existed, and may not even have reached the age of reproduction until it was older than most of our great-grandparents ever became. It is moving through the deep right now, somewhere, in the middle of a life measured in centuries, indifferent to every change that has swept across the surface world during its long, slow existence. There are deep corals, animals, not plants, building their slow structures in the lightless cold that have been standing in the dark for thousands of years, adding an imperceptible fraction to themselves with each passing century, alive since before the oldest human monuments, and still growing, still adding, still patiently building in a darkness that has outlasted every empire that ever rose and fell in the light above them. And the slow biosphere we spoke of, the life inside the rock beneath the seafloor, takes this to an extreme that strains the meaning of the word alive. Microbes down there that may divide once in 1,000 years, once in 10,000 years. Cells persisting across spans of time that dwarf the entire history of our species, metabolizing so slowly that a single one of them might be, in a real sense, older than human civilization, sitting in the dark inside the planet, doing the slow chemistry of survival on a timescale we have no instinct for at all. The deep is where the planet keeps its slowest, most patient life, and it is where the planet keeps its memory. The water at the bottom of the abyss, in some places, last touched the surface and saw the sky 1,000 years ago, before sinking at the frozen poles and creeping along the bottom of the world in currents measured not in speed, but in centuries. To descend into the deep is, in a real and physical sense, to descend into the past, to move through water that remembers a sky no living person ever saw. Now hold that slowness against what we discussed before. Hold the 1,000-year corals and the centuries-old sharks and the 10,000-year microbes against the machines the size of buildings that may soon be scraping across the abyssal plain. Hold the million-year nodules against the appetite of a single decade. The deep heals on a timescale of centuries and millennia. We damage it on a timescale of quarters and fiscal years. The mismatch is almost incomprehensible. We would be making decisions on the timescale of a human impatience, with consequences on the timescale of the deep's slow patience, carving wounds into a world that measures recovery in spans longer than recorded history, to satisfy needs measured in the span of a market cycle. When we damage the deep, we are not borrowing against years. We are borrowing against ages. The scars we leave there may still be there, unhealed, when everything we built the metals into has crumbled to rust and been forgotten. And there is something almost sacred in that slowness, something the surface world has almost entirely lost. We live up here in a frenzy. Everything is fast, getting faster, measured in instants, consumed and replaced and forgotten at a pace that leaves us perpetually breathless. And down there, in the dark, beneath all of it, there is a world that has never hurried, that has never once been in a rush, that has been doing the same patient, slow work since before there was anyone to be impatient. A world where a creature can take 100 years to grow up, and a coral can take 4,000 years to become itself, and the water can take 1,000 years to make a single, slow circuit of the globe. The deep is the last truly patient place. And we, the most impatient creatures the planet has ever produced, are reaching down into it with machines, in a hurry, the way we reach into everything. The deep has outlasted everything so far. It outlasted the rise and fall of mountain ranges on the surface. It outlasted the great extinctions that wiped the land and the shallows clean again and again. It outlasted every catastrophe the planet ever threw at the world above, because it is so deep, so cold, so stable, so removed, that the disasters of the surface barely reached it. The deep is the most enduring environment on Earth. The question now, the new question, the one that did not exist until our own moment, is whether it can outlast us. Whether the one force in 4 billion years that the deep cannot ignore, cannot wait out, cannot simply absorb in its slow, patient way, turns out to be a small, fast, impatient, sunlit creature that learned, just recently, how to reach the bottom of the world. There is a temptation in all of this to think of the deep ocean as a separate place, a distant curiosity, a dark, exotic basement beneath the real world, full of strange creatures, interesting to learn about, but ultimately disconnected from the warm, lit life of the surface, where everything that matters to us actually happens. And that, it turns out, may be the most dangerous misunderstanding of all. Because the deep is not separate. The deep is the foundation. The deep is the hidden machinery that keeps the surface world, our world, the world we depend on for every breath and every meal, alive and stable. And we are tampering with that machinery before we have any idea how it works. Start with the air you are breathing right now. A great deal of the oxygen on this planet comes from the ocean. From the tiny plants drifting in the sunlit surface waters, yes, but those surface waters are part of a single connected system that reaches all the way down. And the deep is the other half of that system. When those tiny surface plants die, and the creatures that ate them die, their bodies sink. That slow, ceaseless rain of the dead drifting down through the dark, the marine snow we have watched falling at every layer of this descent. And as it sinks, it carries something with it. Carbon. Carbon that was pulled out of the atmosphere at the surface, locked into living bodies, and now, in death, sinking down into the deep, where much of it is buried and stored, removed from the air, for centuries, for millennia, sometimes for ages. The deep ocean is one of the great carbon stores of the planet. A vast, slow, dark reservoir that pulls the carbon of the surface world down into itself and keeps it. And in doing so, helps regulate the temperature of the entire planet. Helps keep the climate within the narrow band that life on the surface can endure. The deep is, in other words, part of the planet's thermostat. The endless falling of the dead, the slow burial of carbon in the abyss, the great patient circulation of cold water sinking at the poles and creeping along the bottom of the world for 1,000 years before rising again, all of it is machinery, vast and ancient and almost entirely invisible to us, that has been keeping the surface world habitable for longer than there have been humans to be kept alive by it. We live on the thin, warm lid of a system whose engine is in the dark below us, and we have only just begun to understand how that engine works. Which means that when we talk about damaging the deep, about stirring up the abyssal plains with mining machines, about poisoning the trenches with our waste, about disrupting communities of life we have never even cataloged, we are not just talking about harming some distant, exotic wilderness that has nothing to do with us. We are talking about reaching into the hidden machinery that keeps our own world running, with tools we do not fully understand, in a place we have barely explored, with no real ability to predict what might break. The creatures of the deep that bury the carbon, the slow currents that store the cold, the dark biosphere inside the rock that cycles the chemistry of the planet. These are not curiosities. They are load-bearing. They are part of what holds the habitable world together. And we are about to start pulling on them, hard while still mostly blind to what they do. There is a kind of arrogance in disturbing a system you do not understand, on the assumption that it does not matter. And it is the same arrogance that led an earlier century declare the deep ocean dead and empty. The same arrogance that has let us neglect the largest part of our own planet for so long. We assumed the deep did not matter because we could not see it. And the deep, all the while, was quietly doing some of the most important work on the planet. Work our own survival rests upon, in a darkness we never bothered to enter. The unexplored is not the unimportant. That may be the single hardest lesson the deep has to teach us, and the one we have been slowest to learn. The fact that we cannot see a thing has never had any bearing on whether it matters. And the deep, vast, dark, unmapped, unwitnessed, may matter more to our survival than almost anything we can see. Everything is connected to it.
The fish on your plate, in many cases, spent part of its life feeding in or migrating through the deep, or fed on creatures that did. The carbon you exhale may someday sink into the abyss inside the body of something that ate the plankton that absorbed it. The rain that falls on the land, the temperature of the air, the chemistry of the whole living surface, all of it is bound up through 10,000 invisible threads with the dark world below. We imagine ourselves as creatures of the surface, living a surface life, with the deep as a remote backdrop. But there is no backdrop. There is one connected world, mostly dark, mostly deep. And the lit surface where we live our whole lives is the smallest and most dependent part of it. A thin, bright layer riding on top of an enormous engine it does not understand and cannot live without. And we are reaching into the engine, in the dark, with our eyes barely open, hoping it does not matter. The deep has kept us alive for our entire existence as a species, silently, without our knowledge or thanks. And our first real act, upon finally gaining the power to touch it at scale, may be to wound it. Let me give you a sense of just how alive the frontier still is, how the unknown is not some abstract statistic, but a steady, ongoing flood, arriving in real time, right now, faster than anyone can keep up with it. Picture the work as it actually happens. A research ship, somewhere over the open ocean, holding its position above a stretch of seafloor that no one has ever surveyed in detail. A robot the size of a small car, tethered to the ship by a cable kilometers long, sinking slowly through the dark, its lights and cameras feeding a live picture back up to a darkened control room where scientists sit, watching screens, hour after hour, as the bottom of the world scrolls slowly past. And again in those control rooms, there comes a moment that the people who do this work describe in almost the same words every time. A shape drifts into the lights. Something moves across the screen. And there is a pause and a leaning in, and someone says quietly, "I don't know what that is." And then someone else, "I've never seen that before." And then the slow electric realization spreads around the room that they are, at that very moment, the first human beings ever to lay eyes on a living thing. That the creature on the screen has no name, exists in no book, has never once been seen by any member of our species in all of history, and is being witnessed now, for the first time ever, by the handful of tired people leaning toward a glowing monitor in the dark. That moment happens constantly. It happens on expedition after expedition, in trench after trench, on ridge after ridge, across every unexplored corner of the deep we manage to point a camera at. New creatures, new behaviors, new landscapes, new questions. The flood of the unknown is not slowing down as we explore. It is, if anything, accelerating, because every new tool we build lets us reach more of the unexplored, and every new patch of the unexplored turns out to be full of things we have never seen. We are not closing in on the end of deep-sea discovery. We are still, after a century and a half of trying, standing at the very beginning of it, watching the unknown pour past on our screens faster than we can name it. And every one of those unnamed creatures is a small reminder of the larger truth. For each one we manage to film, in the tiny fraction of the deep we have visited, there are uncounted others we have not. In the trenches we have never entered, in the abyssal plains we have never crossed, in the vast, unmonitored dark where no machine has ever descended and no light has ever been switched on. The creatures we have seen are not a sample of the deep's life. They are the barest scrapings off the edge of it, the few that happened to drift through the small circles of light we briefly cast into an immensity we have hardly touched. We will keep finding them. For as long as we keep looking, we will keep finding the new, the strange, the unnamed, the impossible. Because the deep is not running low on secrets. It is barely beginning to give them up. And the only real question is how much of it we will get to meet before our own hands change it forever. How much of the unexplored deep we will explore, and how much we will simply consume or contaminate or disrupt in the dark before we ever knew it was there. I want to step back now, away from the science and the machines and the threats, and ask the quieter question underneath all of it. The question that has been waiting at the bottom of this whole descent. What does it mean for you, for me, for the kind of creatures we are, to live our entire lives on the surface of a world whose largest part we will never see? Because that is the situation, stripped of everything else. You were born on the thin, lit lid of a vast, dark world. You will live your whole life there. You will almost certainly never descend more than a few meters below the surface of the sea, never witness with your own eyes the twilight zone, or the midnight, or the abyss, or the trenches. Never see a single one of the creatures we have talked about tonight. Never lay eyes on the largest environment on your own planet. You will be born and live and die on the bright surface, and the deep, the real bulk of the world, will remain, for you personally, a place you only ever heard about. A rumor. A thing other people glimpsed through windows and screens and tried to describe to you, and mostly failed. And the same is true for nearly every human being who has ever lived, and nearly everyone who ever will. Out of all the billions of people across all of history, only a literal handful, fewer than have walked on the moon, have ever reached the deepest places. The overwhelming majority of our species has lived and died with the deep entirely closed to them. We are a surface people. We always have been. The deep is the part of our own home that we, as individuals, do not get to enter. It is the locked room in the house we were born in, the largest room, the one that holds most of the house's true contents, and the one we will never walk into, no matter how long we live. There is something almost unbearable about that, if you let it land. We tell ourselves we live in a known world, a mapped world, a world we have conquered and understood. And the truth is that most of the world we live on is, to us personally, as unreachable as another planet, closer than the moon, and just as far beyond our individual lives. We will go to our graves never having seen the place where most of life on Earth actually lives. We are like people who spent their whole lives in a single bright room of an enormous, dark mansion, and called the room the world, and never once opened the door to the vast, cold halls beyond it, because the door was too heavy and the dark too deep, and we had grown so comfortable
in the light. And yet, and this is the turn, the thing I have been wanting to arrive at, I'm not sure that is only a loss. I have come to think there might be something we need in it, something the deep offers us precisely by remaining beyond our reach. Because we are a species drunk on our own dominion. We have mapped and named and claimed and altered nearly everything we can touch. We have bent the land to our will, lit up the night, reshaped the climate, reached past the planets. We have grown so accustomed to mastering things that we have nearly forgotten what it feels like to stand at the edge of something genuinely larger than us. Something we do not control, do not understand, cannot conquer, and may never fully know. We have run out of frontiers on the surface. We have run out of places that humble us. And then there is the deep. Vast, dark, ancient, indifferent, almost entirely unknown, sitting right beneath us the whole time, the largest part of our own world, refusing to give itself up. There may be something we badly need in the simple fact that it is still there, still unconquered, still mostly beyond us. A reminder, written into the very planet we live on, that we are not the masters of everything. That most of our own world does not answer to us, does not care about us, does not even know we exist. That there is still a place, the largest place, where we are small and late and ignorant and unwelcome, and that has gotten along perfectly well without us for 4 billion years, and will get along perfectly well without us after we are gone. We go down into the deep, the few of us who go, and we come back changed, not because of what we saw exactly, though what we saw is beyond describing. We come back changed because of what the deep quietly does to the size of our own self-importance. Up here, in the bright world, it is so easy to believe that we are the center of everything, that the world is a stage we walk across, that the story of the planet is the story of us, that life means the warm and the visible and the human. And then you go down into the dark, into the largest part of your own world, and you find an immensity of life and time and mystery that has nothing to do with you at all, that never did, that simply is. And the belief that you are the center of things quietly dissolves, and something humbler and stranger and, I think, far more true settles into the space where it used to be. You begin to understand that the world you live on is mostly dark, and mostly deep, and mostly unknown. That the warm-lit surface is a thin and recent and beautiful exception, a fragile, bright rind around a vast, cold, patient interior that is the real and overwhelming majority of the place. That most of the living things that have ever existed and ever will exist do so in that dark, without sun, without warmth, without the slightest awareness of the bright, busy world above. You begin to understand that we are not the planet's main event. We are a brief and luminous footnote written near the surface in the light, while the long, dark text of the deep goes on and on beneath us, in a language we have only just begun, falteringly, to learn to read. And maybe that is the real reason to explore the deep. Not for the metals, not even in the end for the medicines or the science or the new species, important as all of those are. Maybe the real reason is the oldest one, the one that sent the divers down for pearls, and Beebe down in his steel ball, and Walsh and Picard down through their cracking hull. The need to know what is there. The refusal to leave the largest part of our own home in the dark, simply because the dark is hard to enter. Not to conquer it, not to consume it, just to know it, to witness it, to finally, after all this time, open the door to the great dark halls of the house we were born in, and hold up our small light, and look, and to do it gently before we do it greedily. To choose, just once, to explore something not in order to use it, but simply because it is there, and it is wondrous, and it is ours to learn, and we have neglected it for far too long. That choice is in front of us right now. This generation, this decade, this moment. The tools have finally arrived. We can finally reach the deep at scale, finally finish the map, finally read the water, finally meet the creatures, finally come to know the largest part of our own world. The only question is, what kind of arrival it will be. Whether we will go down as explorers, with our small lights and our open eyes and our care, to finally witness the dark majority of our planet, or whether we will go down as miners, with our machines and our appetites, to strip it before we ever understood it. The deep does not get a say. It never has. The choice is entirely ours, and we are making it now, mostly without noticing, in conference rooms and boardrooms, and the quiet decisions about where to point a research ship, and what to fund, and what to ignore. And whatever we choose, the deep will receive it in silence, in the dark, the way it has received everything else that ever fell into it. It will not thank us for exploring it gently. It will not curse us for wounding it. It will simply continue, patient, lightless, immense, keeping its creatures and its currents and its long, slow, secret time, indifferent to whether we ever truly come to know it at all. But we would know. That is the thing. We would know what we chose. And the kind of creature you are is determined in the end not by the choices that are forced on you, but by the ones you make freely, in the dark, when no one is watching, about a world that cannot speak for itself. So let us gather it all together here near the end, before we begin the long rise back toward the light. Let us take honest stock of how much of the deep ocean we still do not know, because the size of our ignorance is, in a way, the truest measure of the wonder that remains. We do not have a detailed map of most of our own seafloor. 3/4 of it, give or take, remains unimaged in any real detail, an area many times larger than every continent combined, the literal floor of our own world, unseen. We do not know its shape. There are mountain ranges down there we have never properly surveyed, canyons we have never measured, features no one has ever suspected, waiting in the unmapped dark. We do not know how many kinds of living things share this planet with us. The honest estimate of how many species remain undescribed in the deep runs into the millions. Millions of kinds of creature alive right now that no human has ever seen or named. We find new ones nearly every single time we look, and we have looked at almost nothing. We do not know what most of the deep sounds like, or what most of its sounds mean. We have laid microphones in a few scattered places and heard a world full of voices, most of which we cannot interpret, and most of which we cannot even hear. There are sounds in the archives that have never been explained. There is a language of living light written across the entire dark that we have barely begun to read. We do not know how the creatures of the deep truly live when we are not there to disturb them with our lights. We do not know how many of them sense the world through channels we cannot detect. How many invisible games are being played in registers we were never built to perceive. We do not know for most of the single specimen species whether they are the last of their kind or among the most common animals on the planet. We do not know how the isolated trenches relate to one another, or what private experiments in survival each one has run in its sealed, dark valley over millions of years. We do not know, fully, how the deep regulates the climate, stores the carbon, cycles the chemistry that keeps our own surface world alive. We do not know how the slow biosphere inside the rock beneath the seafloor lives, or how much of it there is, or how old its individual cells truly are, or whether what it does even counts as the same thing we mean when we say a thing is alive. And the largest thing we do not know, the question this whole descent has been carrying us toward, is whether life itself began down there, in the dark, around the bleeding vents at the bottom of the sea. Whether the deep is not some strange exception to the story of life on Earth, but the very root of it. Whether the sunlit world we call home and consider the main event is in fact the late development, the colony that crawled up out of the dark and forgot where it came from. We do not know. We may never know with certainty, but we cannot even rule it out, and that uncertainty alone should be enough to change the way you look at the sea. This is not the inventory of a known world with a few remaining gaps. This is the inventory of an almost entirely unknown world with a few scattered points of light. We have not explored the deep ocean. Let me say it as plainly as I can, one last time, because it is the truest sentence in this whole long story. We have not explored the deep ocean. We have stood at its edge in a handful of places for a handful of brief moments across a century and a half, holding up small lights and named the few things that drifted into the glow. And then we have called that knowing the sea, and gone back to our bright lives on the surface and told ourselves we understood the planet we live on. We do not. We barely understand the part we can see, and the part we cannot see is most of it. The deep ocean is still, after everything, after all our maps and machines and centuries of restless curiosity, one of the last truly unknown places in the entire reachable universe. And it is not light years away, not buried under the ice of some distant moon, not hidden behind any veil of impossibility. It is right here, beneath every ship, beneath every wave. A few kilometers straight down from almost anywhere on the blue majority of the planet. Closer to you, at this moment, than most of the cities on your own continent. And more unknown to your species than the surface of worlds you will never touch. It is the great near frontier, the wilderness beneath our feet. The largest unexplored thing in the world, hiding in plain sight, beneath the calm and ordinary surface of a sea that has been lying to us, gently, about its size, since the first human ever stood on a shore and looked out across it and thought, I understand this. This is the edge of the world. It was never the edge of the world. It was the lid. And beneath the lid, the world goes down and down and down, into a dark we have only begun to enter. And it is full, all the way down, of life and time and mystery and meaning, continuing this very second, indifferent to whether we ever come to know it, getting along, as it always has, entirely without us. But let me bring you back for a moment from all of this scale, all of this geology and chemistry and deep time, and put you somewhere small, somewhere you can feel with your own body. Let me put you inside the machine. Imagine the inside of a deep submersible, not the sleek, roomy capsule of a film, the real thing. A sphere of metal barely wide enough to hold 3 people sitting almost knee to knee, their shoulders touching, their breath fogging the cold curve of the wall behind them. There is no standing, there is no stretching. For the length of the dive, and a dive to the true deep can take many hours just to fall, you will sit, folded into a space smaller than the inside of a small car, staring out through a single, thick window the size of a dinner plate, while the world you know disappears above you, one shade at a time. The descent begins gently. The hatch is sealed. The last face on the surface, a crew member leaning over the rail, giving a thumbs up, slides out of view as the sea closes over the top of the sphere. And then, you simply begin to sink. There is no engine roar, no sense of speed. The machine is heavy, and it falls the way a stone falls through honey, slow and certain. The light goes first. In the first minute, you watch the bright surface blue pour away through the window, and by the time you have fallen the length of a few city blocks straight down, that warm, familiar color is already gone, replaced by a blue so deep it is almost a kind of grief, and then by a blue that is barely blue at all, and then by nothing, by black, by the oldest darkness there is. And here is the thing the pilots tell you, the thing that does not come across in any photograph. It is cold. The deep ocean is just a few degrees above freezing, almost everywhere, almost all the time. And that cold seeps through the metal of the sphere and into your bones over the long hours of the dive. People who have done it speak of wearing wool hats and heavy socks inside the capsule, of clutching warm bottles against their chests, of a chill that has nothing to do with the air conditioning, and everything to do with the fact that there are now kilometers of near-freezing water pressing in from every direction. And the only thing between it and your beating heart is a curved wall of titanium and a window you could cover with one open hand. You can hear the pressure. That is the part no one is ready for. As the sphere descends, the metal around you tightens under the growing weight of the water, and it speaks. It pings, it creaks, it makes small, sharp, sudden sounds, a crack like a knuckle, a groan like a ship settling, and every one of those sounds is the hull adjusting to a force that would crush a human body to paste in an instant, if it ever got in. The pilots learn to ignore it. They learn that the sounds are normal, that the metal is doing exactly what it was built to do. But every newcomer, every scientist taking their first dive, sits very still the first time the sphere groans in the dark and listens to the kilometers of water leaning on the thin shell around them, and understands, in a way no lecture could ever teach, exactly how far they are from home. And then, after hours of falling, the floor arrives. It comes up out of the black slowly, caught at last in the cone of the lights. Pale sediment, soft as flour, undisturbed for thousands of years, lying perfectly flat in every direction. The sphere settles, and a small cloud of that ancient dust billows up around the window and drifts back down, slow and dreamlike in the cold. And you are there. You are sitting on the floor of the world, in a place where the sun has never reached and never will. And the lights of your machine are the only lights that have ever touched this particular patch of ground in the entire 4 billion year history of the planet. Sit with that. Most of the human beings who have ever lived have stood, at some point, where another human being once stood. We walk in each other's footprints constantly. The ground beneath our cities has held 1,000 generations. But the explorers who reach the true deep are standing, or rather hovering, in their cold metal spheres, in places no eye has ever seen and no foot will ever touch. They are, for a few hours, the only witnesses this part of the planet will ever have. And then they will rise, and the dark will close over the spot again, and it will go back to being exactly what it was. Unseen, unvisited, unknown. The way almost all of it still is. This is the strange and lonely privilege of the people who go down, and it does something to them. Talk to the ones who have spent their lives diving, the ones who have logged hundreds of hours at depths most of us cannot imagine, and you start to hear it. a particular ache that is hard to name. They have seen things no one else has seen, and that is exactly the problem. Because here is the quiet torment at the heart of deep exploration. So much of what is glimpsed down there is glimpsed only once. A shape moves at the edge of the lights, something long, something pale, something that does not match any creature in any book. And before the pilot can turn the vehicle, before the camera can find focus, it is gone, folded back into the dark, and it does not come again. The encounter lasts a heartbeat.
And then it lasts forever, because the person who saw it will carry it for the rest of their life, knowing they witnessed something real, something alive, something that has perhaps never been seen before and may never be seen again. And knowing, too, that they can never prove it, that there is no specimen, no clear footage, nothing to show the skeptics. Only the certainty, lodged behind their own eyes, that for one instant the deep showed them a creature it has otherwise kept entirely to itself. The history of deep exploration is full of these ghosts, sightings that were never confirmed, shapes on old sonar that no one could explain, things half seen through the porthole in the seconds before a vehicle had to rise, fragments of encounters logged in the private notebooks of serious, careful, unsentimental scientists who would never claim to have seen something they did not see, and who saw, all the same, things they could not name. Some of these were surely tricks of the light, of exhaustion, of a tired mind in a cold, dark box at the bottom of the world. But some of them, almost certainly, were real. Real animals, going about real lives, in a place so vast and so rarely visited that a single glimpse is all our entire species has ever managed to catch of them, and may ever manage to catch. Think about what that means. It means there are creatures in the ocean right now that have been seen exactly once by exactly one human being, and that exist in the entire record of human knowledge only as a sentence in someone's logbook and an image in someone's memory. Not yet a name, not yet a species, not yet anything science can hold. Just a shape in the dark, witnessed once and lost. The deep is full of these one-glimpse lives, and it adds to them constantly, faster than we could ever hope to keep up, because every hour of every dive into the unexplored deep carries the chance of seeing something for the first and only time. And the dives are so few, and the dark is so large. This is why the people who fall in love with the deep tend to fall in love with it completely and forever. It is not a passing fascination. It becomes the shape of a life. They spend years, decades, their whole careers chasing a darkness that gives up its secrets one reluctant fragment at a time. They pour themselves into machines and expeditions and grant applications, into long, cold months on rolling ships, into the endless, slow patience that the deep demands of anyone who would come and know it. And the deep rewards them rarely and incompletely, and never enough. There is always more of it. There is always more dark, just past the edge of the lights, holding more lives, more answers, more shapes that move and vanish before the camera can turn. They will die having seen more of it than almost anyone alive, and they will die knowing they saw almost none of it at all. I think about the loneliness of that. Not a sad loneliness exactly, something stranger. The loneliness of being a witness to a world that cannot witness you back, that does not know you are there, that would carry on in precisely the same silence whether you came or not. The explorers describe a feeling that takes hold in the deepest part of a dive, a profound, almost overwhelming sense of being somewhere they were never meant to be, somewhere utterly indifferent to whether they live or die. Somewhere that has been getting along perfectly well without a single human eye for the entire span of life on Earth. It is not a hostile feeling. The deep is not malevolent. It is something harder to bear than hostility. It is total indifference. The dark does not want you there. The dark does not want anything. It simply continues, and you are a brief visitor in it, a small, warm light passing through. And when you go, it will not remember that you came. And yet they go back. Again and again they go back. Because there is something in the human heart that cannot leave a mystery alone. Something that would rather sit folded in a freezing metal sphere for 9 hours, listening to the hull groan under the weight of the sea, for the chance, just the chance, of seeing one more shape in the dark, than stay safe and warm on the surface and never know. It is the same thing that sent the first sailors over the horizon, the same thing that pointed the first telescopes at the sky, the same thing that will, one day, send people across the gulf between the stars. It is the refusal to accept that there is a part of the world we are simply not meant to see. And nowhere on the planet does that refusal cost so much, or yield so little, or burn so steadily, as in the people who have given their lives to the deep. They are, in a sense, the last explorers. The maps of the land are finished. The poles have been reached, the peaks have been climbed, the rivers have been traced to their sources. The age of blank spaces on the map is over. Everywhere. Everywhere except here. Down here, in the dark beneath the waves, the blank spaces are not only still present, they are the overwhelming majority. The deep is the last place on Earth where a person can still go somewhere truly, genuinely unknown. The last frontier that is also, somehow, the closest one. And the men and women who descend into it are the inheritors of every explorer who ever lived, carrying the oldest human hunger into the one wilderness we have left. A wilderness that begins, remember, just a few kilometers straight down from the deck of any ship. In water you could reach by nightfall, if only you had a way to survive the going. Most of them will tell you they expect to die before the deep is known. Not personally, though the work is dangerous, and the deep has taken its share of lives, and every one of them knows it. They mean something larger. They mean that the deep is so vast, and our means of reaching it are so slow and so few, that no living person will see it truly mapped, truly cataloged, truly understood. They are working on a problem they will not finish. They are planting a forest whose shade they will never sit in. And they do it anyway, because someone has to begin. Because the alternative is to leave the largest part of our own world forever in the dark, unwitnessed and unknown. And because, perhaps, there is a kind of meaning in giving your one brief life to a question larger than your lifetime. A question that will be handed forward, dive by dive and decade by decade, long after you are gone. So when you picture the deep ocean now, do not picture only the creatures and the vents and the trenches and the dark. Picture also the small, warm light moving slowly through all of that immensity. Picture the freezing sphere, the fogged window, the 3 folded human bodies inside it, the groaning metal, the dust drifting up in the lights. Picture the eyes pressed to the glass, hour after hour, hungry for one more shape in the black. Picture the whole, long, stubborn, heartbroken human effort to know a place that may never fully let itself be known. Because that, too, is part of the story of the deep. The dark is the largest character in it, but we are in it as well, small and cold and frightened and unable to look away.
And every one of those explorers, rising at the end of a dive, watching the black give way to deep blue, and then to bright blue, and then, at last, to the broken silver ceiling of the surface, has felt the same thing you are about to feel. The strange reluctance of leaving, the pull of all that dark you are abandoning below, the knowledge that you are returning to the light, to the world of air and warmth and other people, and that most of what you came to see is staying behind, in the cold, unseen, exactly as it was before you came, exactly as it will be long after you are gone. There is one more thing the explorers carry back up with them, and it is the hardest of all to put into words. It is a changed sense of proportion. You cannot fall for 9 hours through the dark, sit on the floor of the world, and watch your single light fail to reach the edges of an emptiness older than the continents, and come back believing the things you believed before. The arguments that filled your days on the surface, the deadlines, the grievances, the small bright urgencies of ordinary life, do not survive the descent intact. They cannot. You have been somewhere that does not know they exist, somewhere that has been not knowing they exist for 4 billion years, and the smallness of your own concerns arrives all at once in the cold and stays with you. Many of the people who go deep describe coming back gentler, quieter, more patient, a little further away from the rest of us in some way they cannot quite name, as though a part of them never fully returned from the dark and is still down there, hovering in the silence, watching for one more shape that will never come again. And maybe that is the truest thing the deep gives us. Not the creatures, not the discoveries, not the slow accumulation of data and names, but the proportion, the reminder, carried back up in the bones of the few who go, and felt second-hand by the rest of us who only listen to their stories, that we are very small, and the world is very large, and most of it is dark, and most of it does not need us, and most of it we will never see. That is not a comfortable thing to know, but it may be one of the most important things there is to know, and the deep, more than anywhere else left on Earth, is where it waits to be learned by anyone willing to fall far enough into the dark to feel it. And so we do not rise. That is the part the surface never tells you. There is no climbing back, not really. Not for anyone who has fallen this far and let the dark get its full measure of them. You can lift a machine out of the water and call it a return. You can stand again in the wind and the light and the loud, bright, ordinary day. But some part of you stays down here and keeps falling, long after the dive is done, sinking quietly through a darkness that will never quite let you stand on solid ground again. So stay a little longer in the place we came to find. Let the surface forget about us. Let the last thin thread of blue that followed us down finally fray and dim and slip away into the black above, until there is no above anymore. Only the dark in every direction, soft and total and complete. The world we came from is still up there, of course. Somewhere, impossibly far overhead, the sun is crossing a sky we can no longer see, and the waves are folding over one another in the wind, and the gulls are turning above a shoreline where someone is standing, right now, looking out across the water, certain they can see to the edge of things. They cannot. The edge is here, beneath them, where we are drifting, and it goes down and down, past anywhere we managed to reach tonight, into a deeper dark that no story has ever entered, because no one has ever been there to bring one back. Feel how quiet it is. Not the thin quiet of a still room, where the silence is only the absence of noise, and you can sense the world humming just beyond the walls. This is the other kind,
the deep kind. The quiet of a place that has never had a sound to lose. Water that has lain undisturbed since long before there were ears to hear it, pressing in from everywhere at once, holding us the way it holds everything, gently, without knowing we are here. There is no echo down here. There is nothing for a sound to come back from. A voice would simply leave you and keep going, out into the dark, and never return. We are sinking now, slowly, the way the snow sinks, that endless, pale drift of the dead and the discarded, falling past us in the lights, falling for kilometers, falling for weeks. The slow, soft rain that has never once stopped in all the time the ocean has existed. We fall with it, down past the last depth a person has ever reached, down past the deepest mark on every map, down into the part of the planet that has no witness and has never had one. And tonight we'll have only us, for a moment, before it closes over the memory of us and is unwatched again. And the strange thing, the thing that settles over you down here, if you stay long enough to feel it, is that none of it is frightening anymore. The fear was a surface thing. It belonged to the part of you that still believed it could be saved, that still measured the distance back to the light. Down here, past all that, the fear thins into something else, something closer to awe, something almost like peace. You are smaller than you have ever been, in a dark, older than anything you can hold in your mind, and instead of terror, there is a vast and quiet calm. The calm of finally letting go of the idea that any of this was ever yours to keep. Below us, the slow lives go on. The corals stand in the cold exactly where they have stood for thousands of years, growing by the width of a thought each year, keeping a time so patient it makes a human life feel like a single indrawn breath. Deeper still, sealed in the rock beneath the floor, the buried cells divide once in an age and wait out the millennia in the dark, alive by a definition we are still arguing over, indifferent to the argument. Somewhere off in the black, the vents breathe their hot mineral breath into the freezing water, and the pale crowds that live on them sway in the current, never having known the sun, never needing to, complete in a world that asks nothing of the sky. None of it is waiting for us. None of it ever was. It simply is, and goes on being in the dark, whether we come or not. And far away, so far that the sound takes a long time to find us, there is the call again. The single low note threading out through the deep, traveling further than any voice has a right to travel, crossing 1,000 kilometers of black water in search of an answer that may not be out there at all. It is not sad, exactly. Sadness is a surface feeling too. It is something older than sadness. It is the sound of being alone in something enormous, and calling anyway, and not stopping. The oldest gesture there is, made into a note, drifting through a dark that swallows it whole and gives nothing back. We listen to it fade. We let it go, and the silence comes back in behind it and holds. This is the truth the deep keeps, the one we came all this way to stand at the edge of. The world you live on is not the bright, thin skin you walk across in the light. That is the smallest part of it. The world is mostly this. Mostly dark, mostly cold, mostly water, mostly silence. Mostly unwatched and unmapped, and entirely unbothered by the brief, warm species that named itself the master of the planet, and never once went down to see the largest room in its own house. We are surface creatures. We were born to the light, and we will die in it. Most of us never knowing that beneath every ocean we ever sailed across, there was all of this. waiting. The realer and larger and stranger majority of our own home. It is stranger than we understand. That is the part to carry up with you, if anything comes up at all. Not the facts, not the names of the creatures or the depths of the trenches, or the numbers that try and fail to hold the scale of it. Just the strangeness. The quiet, enormous, humbling strangeness of a place so close you could reach it by nightfall, and so unknown that we have seen less of it than we have seen of the surface of the moon. It is down there now. It will be down there tomorrow. It will be down there long after this voice has stopped and you have gone back to the light and forgotten for whole years at a time that it exists at all. And then, some evening, you will stand at the edge of the sea, and you will remember, and the surface will look different to you, the way it never can again. We are very deep now. The lights are almost pointless here. The dark drinks them a few meters out and gives nothing back, and beyond that small failing glow, there is only the pressure and the cold and the endless, patient water, going down past anything we will follow it into tonight. This is as far as we go. Not because the deep ends here. It does not. It falls away below us still, into places we have no way to reach and no real way to imagine. But because this is the edge of what one journey can hold. The rest is for the dark to keep. The rest is for some other century, some braver and humbler people than we have yet learned how to be, to come down and stand at the edge of, the way we have stood at the edge of it tonight. So let us simply stop here and drift and let the dark have us for one last moment. Feel the cold. Feel the weight of all that water. Feel how small you are and how old this place is, and how little of it you will ever see. There is no fear in it now, only the slow, suspended quiet of a world that does not need you, holding you anyway, for as long as you are willing to stay. Above us, somewhere we can no longer see, the surface is still moving, the long, slow swells lifting and falling in the dark, the wind dragging the water into ridges that catch the last of the light and let it go, wave after wave after wave, the way they have since before anything was alive to watch them. Down here, none of that reaches us. Down here, there is no wind, and no light, and no morning coming. Only the deep and the cold, and the silence, and the slow drift of the snow, falling past us, falling below us, falling on into a dark that has no bottom we will ever find. We will leave it the way we found it, exactly the way we found it, because nothing we have done tonight has changed it in the smallest degree. We came down with our questions and our lights and our small, warm, wondering minds, and the deep received us the way it receives everything, without notice, without resistance, without the faintest stir of recognition. And now it will let us go the same way, and close behind us, and forget. The water we drifted through will settle. The snow we fell beside will reach its bottom in its own slow time. The dark we borrowed for an evening will go back to being what it has always been, unentered, unwatched, complete. And if no one ever comes this far again, if this is the last time a human mind ever drifts down through this particular patch of black, the deep will not mourn it, and will not mark it, and will go on exactly as it would have anyway, falling away beneath the waves into a silence that was never ours to break. That is the feeling to keep. Not the answers, because we found so few. Not the fear, because the fear belongs to the surface and cannot follow you down. Just the drift, just the cold, just the vast and patient quiet of the largest part of your own world,
going on without you in the dark, indifferent and ancient and almost entirely unseen, close enough to touch and stranger than anything you will ever fully know. And somewhere far above all of this, the last wave breaks over a quiet shore and pulls back and is gone. And beneath it, where it has always been, where it will always be, the ocean goes on, falling into the dark, in silence, without us.